book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Homewreckers by Aaron Glantz, a Pulitzer Prize finalist. The subtitle is How a Gang of Wall Street Kingpins, Hedge Fund Magnates, Crooked Banks, and Venture Capitalists suckered millions out of their homes and demolished the American dream. It's quite a subtitle. This is from chapter 21, titled Triumph of the Homewreckers. Donald Trump took the oath of office on a chilly Friday morning, delivering an inaugural address that promised an end to the corruption and impotence that had widened America's historic wealth gap. He understood that his victory had been propelled by harnessing the public's rage and envy at having been left behind in the economic recovery, and that he promised that he would not forget it. Evoking FDR's famous Forgotten Man speech from 1932 that promised to prioritize the needs of, quote, the man at the bottom of the economic pyramid, Trump declared, quote, the forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. Politicians had prospered, he said, but jobs had evaporated, factories closed. Quote, the establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little chance to celebrate for struggling families all across our land. This all changes, starting right here and right now, Trump proclaimed, because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you. This is your day. This is your celebration. End of quote. The moment, however, belonged not to the great mass of struggling Americans, but to the new president's most ardent supporters, flamboyant businessmen who profited off the pain of the housing bust and were now poised to steer the ship of state for at least the next 4 years. As Trump reached out his hand and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States of America, his close friend and inaugural committee chair, Tom Barack, stood behind him, smiling in a blue scarf and black overcoat. Afterward, Barack and Trump embraced at the U.S. Capitol's inaugural platform. The homewreckers had arrived. Barack didn't take an official position in the Trump administration, reportedly turning down an offer to be White House Chief of Staff, Treasury Secretary, or Ambassador to Mexico. Roger Stone told me he could have had any position he wanted, but working for the government would have meant making a lot less money. I don't think he has the belly for public service, Stone observed. Other homewreckers had no such qualms. If they changed the rules of the game now, they could make more money later. Steve Mnuchin, by now dubbed the foreclosure king by his critics, was confirmed as Treasury Secretary. His top deputy at One West, the bank, Joseph Otting, became the nation's chief bank regulator, the comptroller of the currency. Wilbur Ross, the bankruptcy tycoon who bought Florida's Bank United, became the Commerce Secretary, charged with everything from negotiating trade deals to overseeing the U.S. Census. Steve Schwarzman, the chairman of Blackstone, became chair of the White House's Strategic and Policy Forum, a group of business leaders who were to meet regularly with Trump. Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase was named vice chair. Though the group disbanded over the summer after Trump's statement that bigotry and violence on many sides were responsible for a white nationalist killing a counter-protester in Charlottesville, Virginia, Schwarzman, along with Barack, is said to be among a small group of outsiders, including Sean Hannity, who are put directly through to the president rather than being routed through the normal communications channels. Hannity reportedly chats with Trump nightly. Schwarzman has flown on Air Force One. On February 12, 2017, less than a month into Trump's presidency, while the commander-in-chief was dining with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan at his Mar-a-Lago golf club, Schwarzman threw a massive 70th birthday bash at his Four Winds estate, barely a mile and a half away. This time, neither Donald nor Melania Trump could make it, but daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner did, along with Mnuchin, Ross, and a who's who of high finance and culture, from Henry Kravis, co-founder of the hostile takeover firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, to the fashion designer Donatella Versace. The party featured live camels, trapeze artists, fireworks, and a gondolier. Schwarzman's tennis courts were covered with Asian-themed staging. The man who'd hired Patti LaBelle to sing Happy Birthday for his 60th was serenaded by Gwen Stefani on his 70th. After Happy Birthday, the peroxide pop star took a, quote, a quick twirl with the birthday boy around a dance floor constructed inside a two-story tent where acrobats shimmied and jumped, the New York Times reported. Unlike a decade before, when Schwarzman's glorious pre-bust bash sparked condemnation from sources as conservative as the Wall Street Journal. This time, the festivities sparked very little blowback. In her story, Bloomberg reporter Amanda Gordon reveled in the comparison with Schwartzman's 60th. There were some differences, though. She wrote, "Remember that beautiful fur coat on Melania Trump? It was New York in February on a weeknight. This time, no bundling required, with many folks golfing and swimming all day before a balmy night and fireworks alongside a full moon." Howard Marks, the co-chairman of Oak Tree Capital, a vulture firm that had bought and flipped 3,000 foreclosures, told Gordon, quote, "The world is an uncertain place. A lot of people are unhappy with a lot of other people. There are a lot of things that people are upset about. So it's nice to have an evening where everybody's happy, harmonious, and upbeat."
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. It's Wednesday. It's the day after the election. There's big news. We've got a lot to cover in the program today. I want to get into the takeaways from yesterday's election. There's still a few results that are not in yet, but we're seeing some really significant trends that make me very optimistic. I'll share that with you in just a moment. Also, my op-ed for today over at HartmannReport.com is titled, "What is the End Point for Republican Terrorism?" We'll get into that. In our second hour, Professor Richard Wolff, the economics professor, is going to drop by. He's got an interesting little tweet thread about inflation leading to directly to authoritarianism. It's certainly what happened in Germany in the 30s. We will discuss that. And also, is the Republican Party focusing most of their efforts, or many of their efforts, to put Trump or DeSantis or, some mini-me Trump in a position to steal the 2024 election? We'll get into that in the second hour. And in the third hour, P.E. Moskowitz will be with us. Is the antidepressant industry about to hit a reckoning? We went through this with Valium and those benzo drugs back in the 60s, Mother's Little Helper, and then discovered, whoa. And then the same thing with, opiates and Purdue Pharma back in the 90s and early 2000s. And then it was like, oh, no. Well, we'll talk about antidepressants today in the third hour. And geeky science, decarbonizing the U.S. energy systems would save 50,000 lives every year in the United States, as well as $600 billion. Plus, we would get, to drive those really cool electric cars. Anyhow, we'll talk about that in the third hour of the program today. But I want to start with the election results. I think that there's two in particular that I want to flag for you that I think are fascinating. John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, the top line story that you're hearing from all the news reports is that, Fetterman won the Democratic primary. What they're not telling you is that the guy he was running against, Connor Lamb, who is a U.S. member of the U.S. House of Representatives representing Pennsylvania, was the, shall we say, corporate Democratic candidate. And Fetterman ran as not being that. And as a result of that, this massive health insurance super PAC that does not want Medicare for all weighed in heavily on behalf of Connor Lamb and attacking John Fetterman. And yet, he won in every single county. So, that's in the entire state of Pennsylvania. It's pretty mind-boggling. People want progressives, increasingly. They're over it with the old, get along, go along. In fact, one of the ways that Fetterman won was by calling Connor Lamb the Joe Manchin of Pennsylvania. Also in Pennsylvania, Representative Summer Lee is narrowly ahead right now of union avoidance lawyer Steve Irwin. Now, this is a guy who advises companies on how to bust unions. He's a Democrat. He's running in the primary. And he had $3.4 million spent against Representative Summer Lee and, on behalf of, presumably, Steve Irwin by AIPAC. We've got Israel in the United States, in our elections, trying to swing our elections. And still, You know, it looks like, you know, there's still some votes out in that particular race, but it looks like the progressive is going to win. At the end of the day, the top of the ticket, the governor's race, is going to be Josh Shapiro. He's right now the attorney general, and he's very popular. And he's very progressive. He prosecuted a major pipeline company, a huge conglomerate. He prosecuted a student debt bank for the way that they've been treating students. He prosecuted the Catholic Church. He's going to be facing Doug Mastriano, Republican State Senator Doug Mastriano, who was actually there on January 6th. He's going to be facing a real nutcase, a genuine insurrectionist. Now, here in Oregon, it gets really fascinating. The results are not all in, and the problem here is that Clackamas County, which is, about half of one of our, hang on just a minute, let me get the details on this. Clackamas County is, there we go, 45, it's home to 45% of the, there's been redistricting here in Oregon, and so the districts aren't quite the same. Schrader is running partly in his old district and partly in a new district, essentially. And about 45% of that vote is Clackamas County, and Clackamas County screwed up and printed the wrong codes for the scanners to read on the ballots. And so there's roughly 40,000 ballots that have to be recoded by hand and then run through the scanning machines again. But so that said, so far, Jamie McLeod Skinner is leading Kurt Schrader 61-39. Kurt Schrader, you'll recall, well, Jamie McLeod Skinner has been on this program. Kurt Schrader is the guy that led the opposition in the House of Representatives among Democrats against Build Back Better. He's the guy whose vote helped stop Democrats from allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. McLeod Skinner had been running around the state calling Kurt Schrader the Joe Manchin of Oregon, or the Joe Manchin of the House of Representatives. And, that's a big deal. Not to mention the fact that Big Pharma Front Group spent $1.1 million pushing Kurt Schrader, and he got an $800,000 boost from a pro-Israel super PAC that, goes through a front name Mainstream Democrats PAC. And still, Jamie McLeod Skinner looks like she's going to win. Now, like I said, there's a huge if. Clackamas County votes haven't been counted yet. Also here in Oregon, in the 6th District, State Representative Andrea Salinas appears to have beaten Carrick Flynn. This was a fascinating study. Carrick Flynn, nobody knew who this guy was. He just came out of nowhere. But this Bitcoin billionaire put $13 million into a race for a single new district in the House of Representatives. That's massive. And this is the so-called Protect Our Future PAC. It's bankrolled by this cryptocurrency billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried. And the other PAC that was on the side of Carrick Flynn was run by Robbie Mook, the guy who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. It's called the House Majority PAC. Again, supporting corporate Democrats over progressives. It's pretty amazing. There was a new NBC News poll that said nearly 2/3 of the party's voters, of Democratic voters, want to vote for a candidate, quote, this is from the poll, quote, who proposes larger scale policies that cost more and might be harder to pass into law, but could bring major change on the issues of healthcare, climate change, the cost of college, and economic opportunity. In other words, the Sanders-Warren platform essentially is winning big. In North Carolina, Representative Ted Budd, this is on the Republican side, who was backed by both Donald Trump and the right-wing billionaires who run the Club for Growth, beat the former, quote, reasonable Republican governor, Pat McCrory, 59-25. So the primary voters are all in on crazy. They're going to go up against Supreme Court Chief Justice Sherry Beasley, who won the Democratic primary with 81% of the vote. Nobody was running against her. John Fetterman, of course, has defeated Connor Lamb 59-26, as I mentioned. You know, John Fetterman calling Connor Lamb the Joe Manchin for Pennsylvania. State Senator Chuck Edwards ended Madison Cawthorn's, shall we say, bizarre career, 33-32. And so Chuck Edwards, the Republican Edwards, is going to go up against Buncombe County Commissioner Jasmine Beach Ferreira, who won the Democratic primary with 60% and is a progressive. In Pennsylvania, it's down to the wire between Mehmet Oz and David McCormick. Oz, of course, endorsed by Trump. McCormick sucking up to Trump. So we'll see how it all goes, how it all shakes out. I think this is absolutely fascinating. You know, a lot going on here. I want to get into the Republican Party's support of terrorism as well. This is extraordinarily troubling. There are three things necessary for a terrorist movement to succeed in a nation. We saw them all in Iraq. We saw them all in Syria. We saw them all in Afghanistan. We're seeing them all now in the United States. I'll share that with you on the other side of this break. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Fascinating times here as we move toward this fall's election. I'm getting more and more optimistic every day. And welcome back. Lisa in Van Nuys, California. Hey, Lisa, what's on your mind today?
Hey, I wanted to ask you about, there was an article yesterday in yesterday's New York Times about how the Democrats tried to redraw the map in New York.
Right.
And the court struck it down. Republicans are doing this all over the country and getting away with it.
Yeah, Ohio most noticeably, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, Democrats try that and they get slapped down. I mean, what is this? Was this a Trump judge, you know?
No, it was
get
it was the state Supreme Court that knocked it down in New York, and I believe all of the people on the state Supreme Court are Democratic appointees. The court just said, you know, the Constitution says you can't gerrymander like crazy, and so we're going to prevent you from doing it. The same thing happened in Ohio, although it was a federal court. It wasn't. I believe it was a federal court. Actually, I may be wrong on that. It might have been the state Supreme Court in Ohio as well. But the difference is that in Ohio, the Republicans said, we're just going to ignore the court. And we're going to go ahead with this, you know, using our maps for the primaries and just, you know, tough luck, guys. Whereas in New York, the Democrats said, okay, if that's what the Supreme Court says, then we'll go back to the drawing board. So the Democrats are playing by the rules. The Republicans aren't. Surprise, surprise, shock, shock. Yeah. And, you know, and I don't think we can blame the Democrats for this. There is a larger question. You have I think it's a little short of a dozen. I think there's 7 or 8, maybe 9 Democratic states that have replaced their gerrymandering. No longer are they doing their gerrymandering or their, say, redistricting is the fancy word. Through their legislatures, they've appointed special, nonpartisan, apolitical, math wonk commissions to draw the districts so that they reflect population rather than demographics or rather than politics. In other words, so that the politicians aren't picking their voters. The voters are picking their politicians. And there are some people in the party who are saying, you know, it's a noble thing, but we shouldn't have gone ahead and done that. Because, you know, if California had gerrymandered within the law, I mean, if they had gerrymandered just to the extent that the states that are not being contested right now, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, if they had gerrymandered like those states, there would probably be 2 or 3 fewer Republican members of the House of Representatives coming out of California. But instead, California just did it honestly. So I think this is going to be a big debate, Lisa, in the Democratic Party going forward. I mean, it's going to be another 10 years before it comes up. But, it's an interesting one. It's a real interesting one. So that's what I know about that.
And also, one more thing, if I could say really quickly. I think the Democrats need to frame the abortion issue as an economic one because, they keep saying it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
If women are forced to have more children, that's going to affect them. They're not going to be able to work.
I think this is an issue that every woman understands, Lisa, but the minute that Democrats start speaking of it explicitly in those terms, although they do, but if they were to front and center it, then the Republicans would be saying, oh, you're killing babies for money, huh? It could be a two-edged sword. But I think your point is well taken, and I don't think that there's very many women in America who don't understand that. So it's probably just as well that it doesn't need to be the center of the campaign. Lisa, I really think bodily autonomy is the important thing. Lisa, thank you for the call. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. So did you hear the story about the three white guys, 20, 22, 24 years old, who just pleaded guilty to trying to attack power grids in three different parts of the United States? According to the Justice Department, their scheme was that they were going to bring down electricity for three basically major cities or major regions of the United States. And the theory of this program is sort of like what Tim McVeigh was all about back in 1990, I think it was three, when he blew up the federal building. Their scheme was that doing so, cutting off the power to these cities. Well, this is from the Department of Justice. Quote, the defendants believed their plan would cost the government millions of dollars and cause unrest for Americans in the region. They had conversations about how the possibility of the power being out for months would cause a race war and induce the next Great Depression. They had suicide pills and everything. Why aren't we talking about white terrorism in America? There's a video about this over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. My op-ed over at HartmannReport.com today is titled, What is the End Point for Republican Terrorism? And, not only did yesterday's election show a strong progressive drift on the Democratic side, this party, the Democratic Party, is going back to its FDR roots right now, and it's a good thing. But on the Republican side, we're seeing an aggressive move toward fascism being promoted both by the Republican base and by its right-wing billionaire donors. And, I think the most visible example of this is the Republican Party's inability or unwillingness to call out the white supremacy and the replacement theory advocates within their own, within the party itself. Liz Cheney yesterday tweeted, the House GOP leadership has enabled white nationalism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. History has taught us that what begins with words ends in far worse. GOP leaders must renounce and reject these views and those who hold them. And she's being attacked for saying that by Republicans. At the same time, last year, 2021, 93% of all politically motivated murders in the United States were done by people affiliated with right-wing extremism, 3% by Islamic extremism, 6% by left-wing extremism, specifically anarchists and black nationalists. And I'm not even sure I'd call that left-wing, well, maybe extremism. But in any case, 91% of all the murders, politically motivated murders in the United States last year were committed by people affiliated with right-wing extremism. Over the past 10 years, according to the Anti-Defamation League, quote, of the 443 people killed at the hands of extremists over the 10-year period, 75% were killed by right-wing extremists. So how does this happen? I mean, we've got this whole replacement theory going, Tucker Carlson promoting it, Fox News promoting it, all that sort of thing. But there are really three things that are absolutely necessary for terrorism to grow in a nation. And we are seeing them right now in the United States. But let's identify these. Number one, there must be an ideology, and at the core of that ideology, a mythology of victimhood that provides the rationale for using terror as a political weapon. In the United States right now, that's the so-called Great Replacement theory. Second, to make terrorism work, there has to be an evangelist community. Now, I'm not talking about
evangelicals, although many of them fit this bill, but an evangelist community, that is to say people who support and recruit new terrorists. There has to be a supportive community for these wannabe terrorists. And they're finding that right now on Fox News. They're finding it on Facebook. They're finding it on multiple well-known websites and gamer sites now. And those must be held accountable if we're going to do something about this, whether it be in the courts or whether it be in Congress, or most importantly, frankly, in the court of public opinion. They need to be, held up, identified, and publicly shamed. The third key to a successful terrorist program is to trigger individual terrorists without your fingerprints being all over it, without specifically, tying responsibility back to the movement. You're seeing this right now in the GOP, trying to pretend that this most recent terrorist killing had nothing to do with them. The law enforcement name for this is stochastic terrorism. Stochastic is a word that means random. But in the context of terrorism, as dictionary.com notes, quote, stochastic terrorism is the public demonization of a person or group resulting in the incitement of a violent act which is statistically probable but whose specifics cannot be predicted. Great example, Bill O'Reilly calling Dr. George Tiller, Dr. Tiller the baby killer. I believe it was over 30 times on Fox News, or in the neighborhood of 30 times. And sure enough, some lone wolf terrorist goes out and shoots Dr. Tiller. Well, he wasn't a lone wolf, as I mentioned yesterday. He had a whole support group behind him. The Buffalo terrorist, the same deal. And these killers come to believe that their understanding of reality is widely shared when high-profile individuals like Tucker Carlson on Fox or Matt Gate tweeting, Tucker Carlson is correct about replacement theory. When those high-profile individuals support the terrorist position, then the terrorists assume that there's a much larger audience out there, there's a much larger support group for them, and then they begin going ahead and engaging in terrorism. We need to break all three of these pieces of the support network and the systems in place right now that support right-wing terrorism in America. If we don't, we're in deep trouble.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
If we do and restore democracy to the United States, we may again become that shining city on the hill that the rest of the world looks to.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Beyond the Valley by Ramesh Srinivasan. This is from Chapter 1, The Power of Data. In November 2017, my Apple MacBook Pro was stolen. It happened on the island of Ibiza, where I was visiting my friend, a documentary filmmaker. We were thinking of making a series of short films to illustrate innovative uses of new technology around the world. We sat together writing down examples of technological innovation, subversion, and creativity we'd already witnessed. We discussed themes I explore in this book, such as surveillance, the gig economy, and the future of work, artificial intelligence, and cryptocurrencies. After uploading our ideas to Google's cloud-based storage platform, Google Drive, we took a short break, locking our laptops in the trunk of our rented car. When we returned, both laptops were gone. Although upset, I was also relieved. I'd be able to recover most of my data because almost all of it was in the cloud. That was what I signed on to when I stored my files with Google as well as with Apple, Microsoft, and Dropbox. But in the bargain, I'd allowed them to profit from my data. It dawned on me, given the terms of service I'd agreed to, that the value of the data of my data to the storage companies was far greater than the value of my laptop to the thief. How many of us are fully aware that companies providing us with cloud storage have ways to monetize our data? They use targeted advertising, for instance, and charge fees once we get hooked on the security and peace of mind that their free services offer. We put faith in these companies to store our files securely, but our private information may no longer remain private if, let's say, the government asks to search through our data. It's also not private because all this data is surveilled, computed, and often manipulated in mysterious ways to influence and shape our behaviors as these corporations see fit. By creating accounts with these companies, we give them access to ourselves. So when we consent to privacy policies, in reality, we're signing on to systems of surveillance never before seen in human history. And we do so without being included or consulted. By desiring to keep our data accessible and recoverable, we lock ourselves into using their services. As I thought about getting my files back in Ibiza, I wondered, does access to my own property have to come with such strings attached? In my relationship to Apple, I find the strings impossible to untie. By purchasing an Apple laptop, I had unwittingly transformed from a customer into a part of the company's product line. I had provided Apple with private data and trusted Apple to protect it. Now, to retrieve that data, I had to purchase a new laptop with Apple-owned peripherals and devices. So I caught the next flight to Madrid. I then took the train to the city's Apple store located in Puerto del Sol. In many ways, this central plaza still serves in its centuries-old role as a landmark and gathering place for the entire Spanish nation, a point from which numerous roads emanate. With its distinctive aesthetic and its strategic placement in a civic space, the Apple Store stood out among the adjacent parliamentary and government buildings as if the global brand were more powerful than Spain itself. The day I was there, more people entered and left the Apple Store than passed through the doors of my neighboring building. In 2017, Apple, a private corporation worth more than $1 trillion, actually began to conceptualize its retail stores as town squares, thereby branding itself an integral part of our everyday lives. Other big technology corporations describe themselves in similar terms. Facebook CEO and founder Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, refers to the company as a social infrastructure for the global community. So what we have in the digital world are privately owned public spheres. They're branded as public, civic, and virtuous, but in reality are dominated by a single logic, extending profitability and economic value. How can these companies' interests be the same as the public interest? Like many other large corporations, Apple is shareholder-owned and therefore primarily accountable to its investors and executives, rather than to its employees, customers, or the general public. I had not begun to unpack the meaning of all this until I realized how monumental the Puerto del Sol Apple Store actually was, as an icon and a structure. As I walked into the store, an Apple employee invited me to purchase a new machine, log onto my iCloud account, and retrieve from Apple Cloud Storage the data that I lost from my stolen laptop. These transactions, completed in less than an hour, were simple and efficient. My data was extraterritorial, easily retrievable in Spain, and likely would be in most other countries. Purchasing a new laptop and getting my data back supported Apple's economic model. National borders were no threat or hindrance. The same was true with retrieving data I had stored on other corporate cloud servers managed by Google and Dropbox. In technology circles, this saying has made the rounds. If you're not the customer, then you're the product. Many of today's technologies come to us for free, but in return, our personal lives come for free to these technologies. But they are accessible for the company's profit and gain. Yes, when we search Google, we look for information, but do we realize that Google is also searching us? Users, and it goes on from there. So the book is Beyond the Valley by Ramesh Srinivasan. Is Why Buddhism is True, The Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment by Robert Wright. Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. 34 minutes past the hour. So what are your thoughts on how this is leading? I'm finding it absolutely fascinating that there is this very clear bifurcation happening in American politics. The middle is getting smaller and smaller, the so-called middle. Now, prior to the Reagan era, the middle in American politics was, people like my dad. I mean, it's both on the Democratic and Republican sides. People who were, kind of okay with the status quo,
Would have liked to see progress in some areas. My dad was particularly concerned about race in America. He was an advocate for. He was an advocate for forced busing, actually, in the 70s. I mean, he was an outlier in the Republican Party in that regard. I've told the story before about when our neighbor wanted to, the girl who lived next door wanted to marry a black man, and her father refused to attend the wedding, and my father walked her down the aisle. That was the middle in America for a long time. Whether they called themselves Republicans or Democrats, they were just, relatively decent people, and of all races. I mean, but trying to just kind of move forward step by step. And the people on the far right, that was the John Birch Society. Those are the people who wanted to, impeach Earl Warren and roll back Brown versus Board. And the people on the far left were the people who thought, maybe we should try communism here or Marxism, or let's all get in bed with Fidel Castro. And they were, fairly small groups. What has happened over the last 40 years, in my opinion, and I don't know, maybe this should become a separate rant that I should write one of these days. But what has happened, in my opinion, over the last 40 years, I'd love to get your take on this when I pick up your calls in just a second. What appears has happened to me is that middle space that used to be occupied by people who were, just incrementally trying to improve the country, that has been taken over by giant corporations and by politicians funded by foreign governments. Whether it's politicians like, we saw the two of the three races I described this morning, heavily funded by Israel, or whether it's politicians on the right who are being heavily funded by Saudi Arabia or by Russia. We saw this in 2016 with the Trump campaign. And of course, the whole corporate thing, that's now the middle, right? We now refer to politicians who are, wholly owned divisions of big pharma or of the weapons industry or of the big ag industry or hospitals and insurance or whatever. We refer to them as moderates or centrists. They're not. They're really, they should be wearing NASCAR patches. They're representatives of corporate America. And as a consequence, we've had this populist split that has come away from the middle, that is splitting away from the middle. And the populists who want to turn America into a white ethno state on the right, the Republicans, they're growing in number. And Donald Trump, of course, and his whole Trumpy movement represents them, and all the Trump humpers following him, the whole MAGA movement. And on the left, it's a movement toward, back to the traditional values of the United States, back toward labor unions, back toward environmentalism, back toward regulation to protect consumers, safety regulations, protecting our food, protecting our pharmaceuticals, providing Americans with economic choices, lowering the prices of drugs, Medicare for all, that kind of stuff. They're both populist movements, because the so-called center is no longer responding to the people. The so-called, the vast majority of Americans think we should have college without debt. That ain't happening. The vast majority of Americans think we should have, reasonably priced health care. Well, that ain't happening. Or reasonably priced pharmaceuticals. That ain't happening. I mean, we get reasonably priced internet access, for goodness sake. None of these things are happening. So, the middle is collapsing, or the middle has rigidified, shall we say. But there's these two trends happening on the outside, on the left and the right. And I think, frankly, the big question, and it's going to have to do with whether America is going to survive, frankly, for lack of a better phrase, is which of those two extremes is going to end up taking over. Because I think the middle is gone. This middle that was created by a series of Supreme Court decisions that allowed politicians to be owned by corporations. Increasingly, it ain't working. Although, which is not to diminish the fact that it's still probably, 95% of the Republican Party and 45% of the Democratic Party. So, your thoughts on that too. Margaret in Weaverville, California. Hey, Margaret, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
Well, thank you and what you do, because how many other places can someone call and express something that's really important on their mind? And I'd like to talk about what you are talking about, but I called in because I'm very passionate about the abortion issue right now, and listening to everyone talking about it and, you know, the arguments. And I want to know, and I wish you would be a person of the public, could promote the fact that we have a plan B. That means we can have no abortions if it was used. I don't understand why the educated people of the world are not talking about we have the solution to abortion. We have the ability to meet both sides of the issue with the Plan B pill. It's not fertilized, so the one side can be fine, and the other side is we don't even have to have abortions. Why isn't the president talking about this?
Well, my recollection, and I may be wrong on this, I'm not a birth control authority or expert, but I understand that the Plan B pill prevents the fertilized egg, because eggs get fertilized in the fallopian tubes, that it prevents the fertilized egg from implanting in the wall of the uterus. And so it just becomes another menstrual period. But it is already fertilized. And so the Catholic Church is strongly against Plan B pills, and as are a lot of evangelical conservatives or whatever. A. B, the Plan B pill is something that, you know, if somebody is well informed about how reproductive systems work, and they are in a committed relationship, and their birth control failed, you know, a condom broke or something, you know, like that happened, you know, might be useful. But, you know, there are birth control failures that don't show up immediately, like a burst condom. You know, there are birth control failures that show up, you know, 5 weeks later when the period doesn't come. And at that point, it's way too late for Plan B. And then on top of that, you've got a huge population of mostly younger women, you know, mostly probably under 18 or 19, who never had sex education in school, who, particularly in red states where sex education is basically abstinence only, and they don't talk about how reproduction happens, who think that, you know, oh, well, the first time you have sex, you can't get pregnant, or if the guy just pulls out, you can't get pregnant. You know, they believe all these myths because they weren't actually taught sex education in school. And so once again, they don't know that they're pregnant until they're really pregnant, you know, until 5, 6, 7 weeks down the road. And at that point, Plan B doesn't work either. Am I making sense, Margaret?
Oh, yes. Well,
I think it needs to be more widely available, but
yes,
and I think it generally is, but that's where the you know, I mean, the milfprostazone, I don't recall how to pronounce the name of it, but you know, this drug that will cause an abortion up to about I think it's 8 to 10 weeks. You know, that is the kind of Plan C, I guess. You know, the real Plan B. So yeah, that's what the states, these red states, are legislating against. They want to make it just like heroin. They want to make it a felony to possess, a felony to receive through the mail, a felony to prescribe, a felony to sell. And that, I predict, Margaret, that's going to be, if this Roe v. Wade decision gets overturned, that's where we're going to see the really big battles happening, is around the abortifacient drugs, the actual drugs. Margaret, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. It's, you know, I share your concern about abortion in the United States. Cliff in Santa Clarita, California. Hey, Cliff, what's on your mind today?
Good morning, Tom.
Hey.
I usually call on Fridays, but I've had this thought. I've been thinking about it. I just wanted to share. I call it selective racism. You know, we see racism out in the open now. You know, Trump opened the closet door and made it okay for these racists to come out and express themselves. But when there's an African American that they can use for their agenda, suddenly they put their racist views to the side.
You're talking about Kathy, what's her name, in Pennsylvania?
Well, yeah, a lower profile one, but you know, Clarence Thomas, Herschel Walker,
Jim Scott. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's just so disingenuous and phony. You know, it's just.
Well, I don't think that you can say that I mean, that suggests, Cliff, that all black people should be Democrats, and I don't think either you or I, as a couple of white guys, could, reasonably should be even having that conversation. I mean,
that's not really where I stand. When you brought up Tim Scott, I wasn't really in agreement because he got elected, so he ran for office and got elected. But the way they can use a Clarence Thomas or prop up a Herschel Walker, I don't know. It just.
I think Herschel Walker. I think Trump's equation there. The reason that he endorsed Herschel Walker was because Herschel Walker is a big name in Georgia, and he was black, and there's a large black population in Georgia. So Trump figured that A, they could peel off part of the black population, and B, there's the great name recognition, and it may work out for him. I mean, we'll see. I doubt it. I doubt it because Herschel Walker
very unqualified.
Oh, and he's apparently a wife beater. So I mean, how is that going to help? Well, maybe it will help him with the Republicans. There's a lot of Republican wife beaters out there running for office. It's just mind-boggling. Cliff, thanks a lot for the call. It's 45. It's coming up on 46 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, helping you win the water cooler wars right here, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Are you feeling optimistic about these election results that we just saw? Or do you think that, some of these are the exceptions to the rule? What are your thoughts? And welcome back, Tom in Huntington Beach, California. Hey, Tom, thanks for listening to KPFK. What's up?
Hey, thank you, sir. I thought I'd mention something about the whole baby formula thing, since Elise Stefanik, Bobart, Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, whatever her name is, they're all jumping on this wagon, saying, they're taking pallets and pallets of baby food and feeding, at the border, feeding the babies. Mm-hmm. And the key is, when you look at the numbers, there's only 750 to 1,000 infants in ICE custody.
All right.
And there's 3.5 to 3.7 million babies born approximately every year in America.
Right. And a lot of those babies, by the way, in ICE custody are being breastfed. It's not like ICE has been ordering pallets of Similac. It's, they've had a warehouse full of it all along. Marjorie Taylor Greene, when she talks about pallets, she's lying through her teeth.
Yeah, but the big key of it is when you say, okay, if we took all that food from those babies at the border, it only adds 1/3,000th by volume to each American baby this year, which means that's like one bottle out of a year, if that. Right. Probably a half a bottle or a tenth of a spoon of powder formula, right? Mm-hmm. So it does them neither good nor bad for us to feed those babies. But to go along with that hateful rhetoric saying, we should let them starve, Tucker Carlson and stuff. And it's like, even if you let them starve, it wouldn't bring up all the American babies, and it wouldn't harm them to feed them. So all it seems like you're looking for is an excuse to starve 1,000 infants. When you show them the volume numbers, I think we need to call out these crazy things they say with just how ridiculous it is and go, okay, let's go with your idea. Let's divide it all up, figure it all out, and go, gee, you're adding this much to each baby. Is that hurting them or harming them? It's not even 1 calorie.
Yeah. It's an excellent point, Cliff. Tom. You're being rational here and scientific and thoughtful, and that's not what Marjorie Taylor Greene is trying to do. What she's trying to do is take a story out of the headlines, which is nonpartisan. It has to do with, you could make it partisan, I suppose, if you want to talk about monopolies or whatnot, or the FDA not being allowed to inspect food factories because, back in the day, is DuPont. DuPont claimed that they had a Fourth Amendment right to privacy, and so inspectors have to announce themselves and they have to make appointments before they can come. And that's the state of things now. This happened about 15 years ago, and the Supreme Court went along with it. So, I suppose you could make it political, but basically what Marjorie Taylor Greene is trying to do is rip a headline from the top of the newspaper and tie it to immigration so that she can demagogue on immigration. That's all she's trying to do.
Yeah, creating a moral panic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is the only thing that these guys have left. I mean, when your agenda is to raise taxes on working people and end Social Security and Medicare, which is now the official Republican Party's agenda, you've got a problem. And how do you fill that problem? Well, you lie to people and you freak out people about brown people and you crank up the racists and you endorse stochastic terrorism. That's what happens. Tom, thanks a lot for the call. And thanks for listening to KPFK. We'll be right back. It's 10 minutes before the hour. Hey, I've got a new book out. It's called The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy. Available wherever you find fine books. Remember Paul Manafort? He used to be business partners with Roger Stone back in the day, working for Republican politicians like, Nixon and Reagan. Well, in 2004, he took a really sweet gig over in Ukraine, helping the Russians, President Putin, install Viktor Yanukovych as the president of Ukraine, a nice Putin puppet. That same year, though, the people of Ukraine said enough, and basically Yanukovych got driven out of the country. So they tried it again in 2010. Let's bring, this Putin puppet back into Ukraine, Yanukovych. And it worked until 2014 when they got kicked out. So he gets kicked out of Ukraine, Manafort. So what does he do the next year, 2015? He decides to run the Trump campaign. Are you starting to see a pattern here? Yeah, could be. Okay, there's an entire video that outlines this whole timeline over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back, Mary in Seattle. Hey, Mary, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I am wondering how it can be legal for Israel to fund our elections. You mentioned that they funded a primary candidate?
Yeah, two of them, actually, yes. Two of your kind of middle-of-the-road candidates against progressives. The reason it's legal is because of the 2010 Citizens United decision. And in that decision, in fact, in the dissent in that decision, written by John Paul Stevens, I don't know if it's still living on YouTube or what, but when that decision came down in 2010, I marked it all up and did like a whole hour show on it, reading at length from pieces of it. But in that dissent by John Paul Stevens, which is really worth reading, and it's not terribly long, Stevens said, under this construction, under this ruling, and it was a 5-4 ruling. It was 5 Republicans versus 4 Democrats. These five Republicans have created a situation where if Tokyo Rose were still alive today, this was the famous Japanese woman who was speaking to American troops on the radio during World War II, telling them, just go home, you've lost, just give up. He said if Tokyo Rose was still around, she would be able to participate in America's elections. She would be able to fund America's elections. And then when Barack Obama called this out, so this specific aspect of it in his State of the Union address in, I believe it was in February of 2011, because the decision came down in December of 2010, as I recall. When Barack Obama called it out, Sam Alito was in the front, and he mouthed the words, not so, or that's not so. Turns out it very much is so. All you have to do if you're a foreign government is set up an American corporation that is run by Americans, and you can pour as much money into it as you want, and that American corporation can then, repurpose that money for any purpose they want with regard to elections. So, here we are. You can thank Citizens United for it, Mary. Answer your question?
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Rob in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Hey, Rob, what's up?
Hey, Tom, real quick, just had one quick point to make, and I've been listening for the last several days on the commentary. And my point is that people don't change, times change. And with that, I mean, human nature is the same as it's always been. And with respect to racism specifically, there's been racism in human nature since the dawn of time, since there was more than one race on the planet Earth.
Coming into contact with each other, yes, I agree. And by the way, it's not even just racism. I mean, look at the Irish. You know, the Northern Irish and Ireland. You know, killing each other. These people who are racially identical, essentially. I mean, you know, it doesn't. Or the Protestant Catholic wars. I mean, there's always been an us and them thing in humanity. Yes, forgive the interruption.
Native Americans.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the times have changed. Times change, and that technology has advanced to the point where, you know, the way that racism is perpetuated on people and spread and whatnot has changed. I mean, you know, now we have the internet, we have whatnot, but I don't blame specifically one thing on the internet, or like, say, for instance, I don't blame Facebook, I don't blame CNN, I don't blame Fox News. I think that the human nature, no matter what technology advances to, human nature, you know, racism is going to exist. I don't know how you get rid of it, but, you know, we're going to
The way you did it, it has to do with identity, Rob. And when people feel that their identity is more tightly bound to a small group than the large group, then you have this problem. I mean, you know, for example, during World War II, we set aside an awful lot of stuff and just pulled together to fight the war. After 9/11, we set aside a lot of stuff and pulled together to fight what we thought was an existential threat. So to the extent that people are not willing to say, yes, I'm an American first, I think that's driving an awful lot of this stuff, Rob.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So the solution is to do, you know, what FDR did during World War II, and I think Joe Biden is trying to do this, is to point out that we all are Americans, and this stuff is tearing us apart, and it's not good for us all. And you know, and we need to look for these larger identities and larger identity structures, because we're never going to stop tribalism, essentially. But if we define our tribe as being Americans in the world, as opposed to being, you know, citizens of a particular state or people with particular political affiliation or racial affiliation, I think it could be a lot healthier. Rob, thanks for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at CozyEarth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at HartmannReport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at Dinovite.com.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Beyond the Valley by Ramesh Srinivasan. This is from Chapter 1, The Power of Data. In November 2017, my Apple MacBook Pro was stolen. It happened on the island of Ibiza, where I was visiting my friend, a documentary filmmaker. We were thinking of making a series of short films to illustrate innovative uses of new technology around the world. We sat together writing down examples of technological innovation, subversion, and creativity we'd already witnessed. We discussed themes I explore in this book, such as surveillance, the gig economy, and the future of work, artificial intelligence, and cryptocurrencies. After uploading our ideas to Google's cloud-based storage platform, Google Drive, we took a short break, locking our laptops in the trunk of our rented car. When we returned, both laptops were gone. Although upset, I was also relieved. I'd be able to recover most of my data because almost all of it was in the cloud. That was what I signed on to when I stored my files with Google as well as with Apple, Microsoft, and Dropbox. But in the bargain, I'd allowed them to profit from my data. It dawned on me, given the terms of service I'd agreed to, that the value of the data of my data to the storage companies was far greater than the value of my laptop to the thief. How many of us are fully aware that companies providing us with cloud storage have ways to monetize our data? They use targeted advertising, for instance, and charge fees once we get hooked on the security and peace of mind that their free services offer. We put faith in these companies to store our files securely, but our private information may no longer remain private if, let's say, the government asks to search through our data. It's also not private because all this data is surveilled, computed, and often manipulated in mysterious ways to influence and shape our behaviors as these corporations see fit. By creating accounts with these companies, we give them access to ourselves. So when we consent to privacy policies, in reality, we're signing on to systems of surveillance never before seen in human history, and we do so without being included or consulted. By desiring to keep our data accessible and recoverable, we lock ourselves into using their services. As I thought about getting my files back in Ibiza, I wondered, does access to my own property have to come with such strings attached? In my relationship to Apple, I find the strings impossible to untie. By purchasing an Apple laptop, I had unwittingly transformed from a customer into a part of the company's product line. I had provided Apple with private data and trusted Apple to protect it. Now, to retrieve that data, I had to purchase a new laptop with Apple-owned peripherals and devices. So I caught the next flight to Madrid. I then took the train to the city's Apple store located in Puerto del Sol. In many ways, this central plaza still serves in its centuries-old role as a landmark and gathering place for the entire Spanish nation, a point from which numerous roads emanate. With its distinctive aesthetic and its strategic placement in a civic space, the Apple Store stood out among the adjacent parliamentary and government buildings as if the global brand were more powerful than Spain itself. The day I was there, more people entered and left the Apple Store than passed through the doors of my neighboring building. In 2017, Apple, a private corporation worth more than $1 trillion, actually began to conceptualize its retail stores as town squares, thereby branding itself an integral part of our everyday lives. Other big technology corporations describe themselves in similar terms. Facebook CEO and founder Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, refers to the company as a social infrastructure for the global community. So what we have in the digital world are privately owned public spheres. They're branded as public, civic, and virtuous, but in reality are dominated by a single logic, extending profitability and economic value. How can these companies' interests be the same as the public interest? Like many other large corporations, Apple is shareholder-owned and therefore primarily accountable to its investors and executives, rather than to its employees, customers, or the general public. I had not begun to unpack the meaning of all this until I realized how monumental the Puerto del Sol Apple Store actually was, as an icon and a structure. As I walked into the store, an Apple employee invited me to purchase a new machine, log on to my iCloud account, and retrieve from Apple Cloud Storage the data that I lost from my stolen laptop. These transactions, completed in less than an hour, were simple and efficient. My data was extraterritorial, easily retrievable in Spain, and likely would be in most other countries.
Purchasing a new laptop and getting my data back supported Apple's economic model. National borders were no threat or hindrance. The same was true with retrieving data I had stored on other corporate cloud servers managed by Google and Dropbox. In technology circles, this saying has made the rounds. If you're not the customer, then you're the product. Many of today's technologies come to us for free, but in return, our personal lives come for free to these technologies. But they are accessible for the company's profit and gain. Yes, when we search Google, we look for information, but do we realize that Google is also searching us? Users, and it goes on from there. So the book is Beyond the Valley by Ramesh Srinivasan.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. You know, when we talk about economics, we often talk about it in a vacuum, essentially. What's inflation going to do? What's the market going to do? How is this going to affect paychecks? But and occasionally we'll get into the mention of it. You know, how is the price of gas going to affect, Joe Biden's reelection chances, that kind of stuff. But very rarely do we put it in the context of really large societal, national changes. But in fact, economics does swing countries. Probably the most famous example is the German inflation of the late 1920s, early 1930s. Professor Richard Wolff has been tweeting about this, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I wanted to ask him to give us a little more of a deep dive into all this. He's the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His most recent is The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. rdwolff with 2Fs.com, also another one of his websites, and Prof. Wolff on Twitter with 2Fs. Professor Wolff, welcome back. So how does specifically, I suppose, inflation lead to fascism, and how, in a larger sense, do economics swing the cycles of world history throughout history?
Well, they do it over and over again. It ought to be a basic understanding of the enormous importance and power of economics in general and economic turmoil in particular. Let me very briefly go with you through the German experience and show you how impactful it is in terms of where we are now here in the United States in 2022. The German economy exploded in the second half of the 20th century. Together with the United States, Germany and the United States were the great challengers to the British Empire. As the century progressed, it became clear that one or the other would replace Britain as the dominant capitalist power in the world, and the British were powerless to stop it. In the end, the Germans and the British went to war, and the Americans went with the British in that war, World War I. But it came as a cataclysm to the Germans because the working class there had wages go up, had itself become wealthy relative to anything the rest of Europe could understand, et cetera, et cetera. And they thought they were in the catbird seat. When they lost World War I, it was a devastating blow to them. But they might have worked their way through it. That war, if you remember, ended in 1918. Then in 1923, 4 or 5 years later, they had one of the worst inflations in the world. German marks went from 4 or 5 to $1 to 5 billion to $1. I mean, prices were doubling literally every couple of hours over months at a time. You had no way to save anything. The frugal German family that had saved money for generations suddenly discovered that all those savings would barely buy you a quarter pound of butter. And then 4 or 5 years later, 1929, they were hit with the Great Depression that hit all capitalist countries. But for the working class of Germany, It was too much. In the space of a decade, they lost the World War, they went through one of the worst inflations in history, and then they were devastated by the Great Depression. There is no coincidence that literally 2 years after the Great Depression hits, begins the real rise to power of Adolf Hitler. The German working class needed somebody, anybody, to prevent their complete decimation. And now here we are in the United States. And let me show you the parallel. We just had one of the worst public health disasters in our history. We had the second worst crash of the capitalist system in our history. We have lost the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then we have an inflation, and now we are expecting a recession. It's too much to impose on a working class. People become very depressed, very desperate. And in that situation in Germany, they went in a fascist direction. And we see the signs of it here. Nobody can tell the future. I can't either. But we ought to be awfully careful about what we are visiting on the mass of the American working people, Democrat and Republican alike, because when the backlash comes, and we're already halfway there, it is not going to be anything we would want to even imagine.
I remember reading a history of that, post-World War I period, and John Maynard Keynes came out and said that if the Treaty of Versailles that was being negotiated by the Allied powers who had defeated Germany, which was demanding massive reparations from Germany and demanding that they be paid in Deutschmarks, if those reparations were to remain in that treaty, that it would produce World War II. He said World War II will become inevitable. He was, I don't want to say laughed at, but ignored, shall we say, largely. And, I think it was very much the case, was it not? I mean, it wasn't much of the German inflation an effort to, since they owed billions or trillions to the rest of Europe in Deutschmarks, to pay it off with depreciated Deutschmarks?
Absolutely. But let me take your parallel the further step that will help people see its relevance. Absolutely. They did impose the reparations. The reparations made Germany's recovery from the war take much longer, make the suffering of the Germans stretch it out further. But more than any real effect, and it had real effects, was the fact that it allowed a demagogue, Hitler, to make an argument which wasn't correct. Namely, what really problematized Germany was the loss of the war and the inflation and the whole structure of their economy and the global depression. But he got rid of all of that and gave them one focus. It's the West. It's Britain, the United States, in cahoots with Russia. He hooked it up that way. And it was the evil others outside of Germany that had to be defeated. He was the only politician determined to rearm Germany to make it possible. The demagogue comes in to the distraught working class, gives them a scapegoat, gives them a way forward, and then watches as the suffering they went through turns them to somebody, and he's the somebody in that moment. The parallel with our own situation ought to occur to everyone.
Well, and I think that parallel is probably best illustrated in the 2016 primary debates, where you had Bernie Sanders taking the populist position that, yeah, the economy sucks in many regards, and it does so because a bunch of billionaires have gamed the system, and the Supreme Court has corruptly allowed them into politics, and we need to go back to a reasonable political system and a taxation system. On the left, you had Bernie Sanders saying that. And then on the right, you had Donald Trump saying, yes, the system is gamed and you've been screwed. But it's because brown people are coming in from Mexico and because political elites have cut, trade deals like NAFTA and things like that, which had some truth to it, by the way. Not the brown people part, but the NAFTA part. And so you had kind of dueling populism, right-left populism, offering solutions to this crisis that America was facing. after, both the crash of 2000 and the crash of 2008. And it seems like the middle has collapsed in all this because the middle has been corrupted by largely Supreme Court decisions and capitalism itself, frankly. I'm assuming that there was a parallel movement in Germany opposed to Hitler, or maybe it was part of Hitler's movement to say, we need to empower the average working person. I know in 1937, when he was on the cover of Time magazine, he was the most popular politician in the world because he had put Germany back together.
Absolutely. The parallels, once you look at it this way and you ask the question, they kind of come at you one after another. In Germany, there was an opposition. There was an extremely strong socialist party, and by 1931 and 2, right next to it, an extremely strong communist party. Together, they were picking up roughly half of the votes in the national elections right up until the moment that Hitler comes to power. Their problem was the socialists had been in power for the previous decade, or much of it, the 1920s. And since that hadn't solved the problems of the working class, it put them on a defensive position, allowing Mr. Hitler to come in and do his thing. It's almost as though you could criticize the socialists and communists, particularly the socialists, because the communists never got into the government the way the socialists did in Germany then. But you could criticize them for not doing enough to really change the situation of the mass of people. Had they done so, it would have been a much stronger defense against Hitler coming in. But they were complicit, kind of in the way that a significant part of the Democratic Party has been, leaving a rump portion, Bernie, AOC, and the rest, having to push more weight than they can handle, given the history that arrives at this point. But it is a very frightening impact that this remembrance of our history ought to deliver.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. Professor Richard Wolff, a fascinating glimpse into economics and history. At democracyatwork.info, rdwolf.com, Prof. Wolff on Twitter. His book, The Sickness is the System. Professor Wolff, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
Great talking with you. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Is the Republican Party focusing most of their efforts to put Trump, or a mini-me Trump, in a position to steal the 2024 election? I'll tell you about that on the other side of the break. And welcome back, 17 minutes past the hour. And I wanted to share this one particular story with you. I find it absolutely fascinating. And it's about the Lincoln Project and Steve Schmidt. Steve Schmidt, of course, was, he's been a lifelong Republican. He's a Republican strategist. He's a very smart guy. And was the guy who ran the John McCain campaign back in, what year was that, 2008, I think? And McCain and Sarah Palin, sadly. He listened to Bill Kristol. And he has now become probably one of the most outspoken Republicans about the rise of fascism within the GOP and how bad it is and how bad it could get and where it could go and all that sort of thing. The serious danger, frankly, that the Republican Party is representing to the United States. He's just come right out and said it. He's calling for Rupert Murdoch to be stripped of his U.S. citizenship. Now, I don't know if that would mean that he could no longer own the Fox network. I don't know if his son Lachlan, who is actually the guy, Rupert's like 81 or something, and Lachlan he's 91, excuse me, and Lachlan is pretty much running the empire now. Whether he's a U.S. citizen or a dual citizen or an Australian citizen, I don't know. But Steve Schmidt wants, metaphorically, blood. He wants action. The January 6th committee will prove a massive conspiracy, he tweeted last night. And he said that conspiracy will likely involve Fox News hosts and personalities. Rupert Murdoch is responsible for what happens on Fox News, which has long claimed in federal court that it is not news but entertainment. Now, in that regard, Steve Schmidt is absolutely right. Fox News, on a couple of occasions, when they've been called on things, like lying about voting machines, for example, where there's actually been a lawsuit and somebody's had to take a deposition, they go into court and they say, we're not news. We don't have to tell the news. There's no law that says that. Just because we say news in our name, there's nothing in law that identifies the word news. News is just another dimension of entertainment. And we do entertainment, and so we say whatever we want to say. So that's the position that Fox News has taken. So then Schmidt goes on to say, Rupert Murdoch is not a birthright citizen like Barack Obama, which is kind of a tip of the hat to the Republicans who were unwilling, like John McCain, who were unwilling to go along with Sarah Palin and, well, really Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump was the godfather of the birther movement and, rode it to political fame for 8 years. So anyhow, he says Murdoch is not a birthright citizen like Barack Obama. He is a naturalized citizen. Though it happens rarely, there is a denaturalization process that can lead to revocation of U.S. citizenship and removal from the country. Now, I'm not sure if Murdoch is still living in the country or if he's gone back to Australia. I've heard both. But interesting stuff. It's not going to happen. But the fact that the guy who ran John McCain's campaign, that high-profile Republican would be speaking like this, I think is consequential. So, we have some open lines here. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the politics of the day, on where this is all going, on how these primaries are shaking out, and what do you think is going to happen in the fall? Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. Have you noticed that people are basically imitating Donald Trump all over the country? We're seeing all this rude behavior, sexist, racist behavior. People getting arrested at airport gates, airplanes being turned around because people are fighting with flight attendants, disorderly, rude, unhinged conduct. I mean, it's just gone nuts. Car crashes are up, gun deaths are up, shootings are up. Healthcare workers are being literally physically assaulted in some hospitals. They're having to put together panic buttons. This kind of behavior in our schools is increasing. It looks like, according to some sociologists, psychologists, and even business consultants, it looks like a lot of this ties back not just to the Trump presidency, with Donald Trump providing us with an example of how to be, an obnoxious person, but also the crisis of the pandemic. We've got a deeper dive into this topic over at ThomHartmann.com. There's a great video about it. You can check it out there. And welcome back. 23 minutes past the hour. Question. This a fascinating question. Are Republican primary voters explicitly trying to put Donald Trump or a mini-me Donald Trump? I'm increasingly thinking that the Republican ticket in 2024 is going to have either. I used to think probably Rick Scott, but now I'm thinking probably Ron DeSantis at its head, and the number two person will be Donald Trump Jr. I think Trump himself, I don't think he wants the work. He loves the adulation. If his son was on the ticket, he could travel around with them. He could do rallies. He could, but he doesn't. He just doesn't like the work of being president or vice president or anything like that. So I'm guessing that that's what we're going to see. But in any case, what we're seeing all around the country are people who are, like David McCormick, like J.D. Vance, who are, the birther equivalent. I mean, they're truthers. They're election truthers. They're out there saying, oh, no, Donald Trump didn't lose the election. It was stolen, quack, quack, quack. And then they're going to the next step, which is trying to pack election boards trying to change election rules. The Republican Party is now trying to recruit 10,000 people to show up in many states armed with weapons in polling places to make sure that the wrong people aren't voting. And you and I both know what they mean when they talk about the wrong people. So we've, the Secretary of State's races, well, with, in Mastriano in Pennsylvania, you've got a guy running for governor who has come right out and said, I'm the guy who will appoint the Secretary of State. I'm going to make sure that I get a Secretary of State who's perfectly willing to ignore the result of the vote. And we will make sure that, whatever Republican is on the ticket in 2024 gets the Electoral College votes in Pennsylvania, regardless of how the election goes. And he's not the only one. There are Republican politicians like this who are saying this kind of thing literally all over the United States. They're showing up in very large numbers in places like Arizona and Wisconsin and Michigan because these swing states, and Florida and Texas, these swing states are being heavily churned by the Republican Party and by the right-wing billionaires who fund the Republican Party. And it's not just happening at the federal level. It's not just happening with these federal candidates like, governor and, well, the governor's not a federal candidate, but, U.S. senator. It is happening at the state level. It's not just happening at the top of the state level, things like governor and Secretary of State and Attorney General and things like that. It's happening even one step down from that at the more local level, with members of the House of Representatives for each one of these states, or Assembly as it may be called, and for the state Senate, for local election boards, for county commissioners. In fact, this is where one of the most aggressive efforts has been being put forward right now by some of the right-wing billionaires who fund the Republican Party through a bunch of their front groups, is getting election commissions, school boards, all this hyper-local stuff, trying to get people on these commissions and on these boards who are basically openly fascist. Because we've got tragically, a very large fascist movement here in the United States. So, a lot on the table here, a lot to discuss: our elections, our primaries, the fate and future of the democracy and the Republican Party. How do we stop stochastic terrorism? What do we do about the terrorism? What will the Republicans do about it? I'll pick up your calls after the break.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be right back with your calls. Stick around. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Stokely, A Life by Peniel E. Joseph. This is from the preface. Stokely Carmichael is a troubling icon of America's civil rights years. His Black Power call became a national Rorschach test. Whereas many blacks viewed it as righteous, many whites saw violent foreboding. Newspapers brooded over Carmichael's words, quickly forming a consensus that judged the slogan to be at best intemperate and at worst a blatant call for anti-white violence and reverse racism. In 1966, Black Power reverberated around the world, galvanizing blacks, outraging whites, and inspiring a cross-section of ethnic and racial minorities. In 1969, Carmichael left the United States for Conakry, Guinea, where he reinvented himself as a roving Pan-Africanist organizer and professional revolutionary. For the next 30 years, he remained an energetic dissident, a throwback to the heady years of the 1960s. Carmichael turned the quest for black political power into his life's work. His faith in a style of politics many considered anachronistic came out of the same tenacity and stubbornness that once made him one of the most effective and controversial activists of his generation. These same qualities, however, limited Carmichael's efforts as a Pan-Africanist political mobilizer. Before leaving America, Stokely resigned as Black Power's glamorous enfant terrible. Telegenic, brash, equal parts angry and gregarious, Whether dressed in three-piece suits, leather jackets, sharecroppers' overhauls, or African dashikis, Carmichael became to represent the era's multifaceted identity. A hipster hero whose easy grace allowed him to consort effortlessly with both the dignified and the damned. The name Stokely Carmichael first came into my consciousness when I was a young boy coming of age in New York City. As the proud son of a Haitian mother who belonged to local 1199 Hospital Workers Union, part of SEIU, I grew up hearing stories of how civil rights activists, Black Power revolutionaries, Pan-Africanist freedom fighters, and trade unionists helped to shape a new world in America and beyond. By the time I was in elementary school, I was on my first picket line, accompanying my mother in support of an 1199 strike. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King supported 1199 during the 1960s. Stokely Carmichael's political importance came into sharper focus when I was in junior high after the premiere of the landmark PBS documentary series Eyes on the Prize, which featured the 24-year-old Carmichael's fiery Black Power speech and rightly characterized Stokely as his generation's heir to Malcolm X. Over the course of a decade of research on Carmichael, I would come to understand him as that and much more. Carmichael's youth, casual dress, and charisma made him an easily identifiable hero, one whose quick smile and passionate speeches left an indelible impression. An adopted son of the South by way of Trinidad, the Bronx, and Harlem, Stokely adapted while transforming whatever environment he encountered. As a native New Yorker growing up in the city's tense racial climate of the 1980s, I found Carmichael's survival instincts appealing. As a young graduate student in Philadelphia, I had the opportunity to hear him speak and briefly met him afterward. He encouraged me to stay committed to the Black freedom movement, a struggle he defined as infinite. With his flowing African robes, gray hair, and white beard, he looked like a prince. And he had changed his name. He was no longer Stokely Carmichael. As Malcolm Little had become Malcolm X and later El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Stokely had become Kwame Ture. It was a name that paid homage to his two African heroes, men who had been the first presidents of their countries, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Guinea's Sekou Touré. Kwame Ture spelled the Guinean's name not as the French did, as white Europeans did, but as Arabs and Muslims did. Sekou Touré, S-E-K-U-T-U-R-E. As a college student, Carmichael helped transform America by organizing sit-ins, demonstrations, and voter registrations during the civil rights movement's heroic years, a period that roughly encompasses the decade between the 1954 Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision, desegregation decision, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and has become enshrined in public memory through national holidays, films, commemorations, and monuments. Carmichael's deep sense of justice contributed to his evolution into Kwame Ture, the Pan-Africanist revolutionary and anti-capitalist organizer who moved to West Africa and remained tenacious in the face of searing political setbacks. Carmichael ultimately judged America incapable of creating the free and just world he had struggled for as a young man. But despite living in Africa for the final 30 years of his life, Carmichael's legendary stature as a Black Power activist lingered even if many ignored his lasting contributions to civil rights struggles that included a bruising quest for the vote in the Deep South. Although today largely forgotten, Stokely Carmichael remains one of the protean figures of the 20th century, a revolutionary who passionately believed in self-defense and armed rebellion, even as he revered nonviolence. The book Stokely, A Life, by Peniel L. Joseph. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. The recent killing of a young black man in Michigan, Patrick Loyola, who was, the police officer was sitting on his back and put a gun right to the back, is just the latest example of police killing people out of traffic stops, and predominantly black people. 28% of the people who are killed in traffic stops are black. But African Americans are only 13% of our population. Police in the United States have killed nearly 600 people during traffic stops since 2017. Mapping Police Violence is the nonprofit that's been doing the work on this. About 10% just this year. About 10% of the 1,100 people killed by police this year have been killed at traffic stops. Dante Wright, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, we know their names and we know their stories, but we're not doing enough to get this under control. Other countries tend not to have this problem. We need to do something now. There's a video about it over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. 35 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. The Pennsylvania Republican primary is still a little too close to call. We'll see how that shakes out. But picking up your calls, Jeff in Gary, Indiana. Hey, Jeff, what's on your mind today?
Tom, very briefly, didn't the Las Vegas shooting of 57 people demonstrate that semi-automatic weapons are machine guns, and shouldn't they be regulated that way?
Yeah, what he had done was... I
know what he had done. I'm a weapons specialist veteran.
Well, I'm saying this for the benefit of people who don't know what we're talking about. He had put what's called a bump stock on his gun, which is where the recoil of the shot basically sets up the, pulls the trigger for the next shot and turns a semi-automatic weapon into a fully automatic weapon functionally, right? Do I have that right, Jeff?
Exactly correct. And a person with a fast finger can fire an AR-14 with its small caliber round actually more quickly than a 50 caliber machine gun can fire.
Right, because there you've got a larger bullet and it takes a longer time to get it into the chamber. So what's the point that you're trying to make?
They're machine guns. Semi-automatic weapons, guns, pistols and rifles are machine guns, and if a revolver or a bolt-action rifle had been used in Buffalo, a shameful shooting, one-fourth or one-third of the rounds could have been gotten off, and the aim isn't good. It upsets the frame of the pistol or pulls the rifle barrel away.
I absolutely agree, Jeff. I mean, if we want to go with the Scalia originalist thought that, we should just do this the way the founders did, people should only be allowed to buy muskets, which takes 10 minutes to load with powder and a ball. But
the regulation...
I'm of the opinion very strongly that semi-automatic weapons should be banned in the United States.
Well, that's right, because they're machine guns, and the regulation of machine guns will do if they are denominated in that way. Can I mention something else?
Very quickly.
I'm a veteran. All my veteran friends vote Democratic, and I have a large circle of friends, most of whom are not Democratic. Not veterans, and those are the fellas that are the problem Republicans. And one last thing, social forecasting by Bob Prechter, who writes socioeconomic theory, taught in many universities, particularly in England and so on and so forth. That social forecasting is wonderful. It's long-term and it's remarkable. Socioeconomics will get you there. And thanks for mentioning Philando Castile. That was the hardest one for me.
Yeah.
I'm from St. Paul.
Yeah. He was the guy who said, I have a concealed weapon. I have a permit. I'd like to reach into my pocket, pull out my wallet, and show you the permit. The cop says, okay. He reaches for his pocket, and the cop shoots him dead, right?
And the young girl he was raising with his girlfriend in the backseat, Daddy, I'm here with you. And she's talking as fast as she can to keep from getting shot as he bleeds out.
Yeah. Yeah. It was... That was grim. Jeff, thank you. Thank you very much for the call.
You.
Spot on. Ken in Lafayette, Colorado. Hey, Ken, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. Earlier, you had mentioned, what can be done to get rid of Rupert Murdoch and Fox News.
Well, I don't think "get rid of" is the right phrase, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So if you recall, Rupert Murdoch / Fox News was found guilty, if you will, in the UK phone hacking scandal.
Oh, that wasn't Fox News. That was wasn't that the Sun, or was it the Times of London? It was one of his papers. I thought that was the Sun.
Okay. Well, but because it's under the umbrella of Fox News, and I could be wrong, but I thought FCC rules and regulations says, hey, if you're if you're a convicted criminal, you can't broadcast in the U.S. So I'm wondering, can that be relitigated? Is there a way to go back on that? Because I was hoping at the time, this will get rid of Fox.
Yeah. I just don't know, Ken. I don't think so. I'm guessing the company was convicted rather than Murdoch himself. Or I know that there was a senior executive, forgetting the woman's name. I can see her in my mind. She was convicted, but I think that they got the low level or the mid level people to take the fall for that. And I'm also not sure if a foreign conviction like that would fly here. And I'm guessing that Fox News itself is probably a standalone U.S.-based corporation, even though it's owned by, the larger enterprise.
Well, so there's no tie-in, though. I mean, it's under the same umbrella, if you will. You'd think that there's a way to.
Well, it should tell you a lot about them. I mean, and I don't know the specific details of why Canada refused to allow Fox News to broadcast in Canada. But, I think it's probably something along those lines. But, this company is on a regular basis spewing poison into the bloodstream of American politics. And it's a tragedy. And I think, frankly, what President what President Biden did yesterday in essentially calling them out, saying, we should not tolerate people who are promoting racism for profit. I thought that was brilliant. Ken, thanks a lot for the call. Betty in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Hey, Betty, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Love your program.
Thank you.
And I support free press. But I want to add a little bit to the last guy, because his subject was what I want to tell you about. I was an avid reader all my life, and now I haven't been able to read for, maybe 10 years. My eyes, I have macular degeneration.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sometime within the last 20 years, there was a wonderful expose in one of the better magazines in the United States against Rupert Murdoch and the fact that he illegally obtained the license to operate in the United States with the help of Republican congressmen. It was supported by factual knowledge, and I'm sure someone now, investigative journalists or you, can go back and find that absolutely true article that was excellent. Go back and you'll find out he is even illegally operating in the United States.
Or at least was initially.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please, somebody do that.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
We've got the call out there. I'm not a scholar of the history of Fox News, but, I'd love to see that article. Betty, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Jerry in Richton Park, Illinois. Hey, Jerry, what's on your mind today?
Tom, how you doing?
Good.
I'm from Richton Park, which is right outside Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
I used to be president of the union that represented all of the rapid transit operators in Chicago.
Very
I retired from that. And a big, big fan of labor. And I'm a big, big fan of Thom Hartmann also. Okay?
Well, thank you.
I don't call in a lot because I just listen.
Thank you, Jerry.
I listen to what you're talking about. It's very good. But one thing I disagree with you on, though, is progressive and moderate Democrats. Not that we don't have them. We do have them. And they both should express what they feel. But this is not a time for them to fight each other. This is not a time. Let's get this cancer out, and then we work on that. But I'm very concerned when we place a moderate versus just progressive, because it's just not good. We don't need people.
If the moderates were more able to win elections than the progressives, or it was 50-50, I would agree with you and totally get what you're saying. But what we're finding increasingly all across the United States, and this is what that poll that I cited in the first hour shows, is that Democratic voters And generally, American voters want action. They want progressive action. They want something done about medical costs. They want something done about student debt. They want something done about global warming. And the so-called moderate Democrats are the ones, who are blocking those efforts. The Joe Manchins, the Kurt Schraders of the world. Kurt Schrader blocked the ability of Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Joe Manchin blocked voting rights and blocked Build Back Better. And doing anything about green stuff.
That's true. That's true. Joe Manchin did. I don't consider Joe Manchin a Democrat at all.
What?
And he never was.
But when you talk about moderate Democrats, he's right. He's the poster boy.
But I know that there are several things that would be passed if this guy wasn't there, you had another Democrat there.
Yeah.
And with the moderate Democrats you have and the progressive Democrats you have, we would get a lot done.
Yeah. Well, if maybe it's a matter of terms here, Jerry.
Yeah, it probably is.
Because there are so-called moderate Dems who are indebted to certain industries. I mean, the Steve Coons of the world, and there's a few, I don't want to start naming names actually, but there's some of these Democrats who are, but they're not openly trying to sabotage a progressive agenda. They're willing to go along with a progressive agenda more often than not. But the ones who have my ire, the ones who I want to see primaried, for the good of the party and for the good of the country, are the ones who are blocking any forward progress. Because when you look at these opinion polls that show that 74% of Americans think that Joe Biden is not moving in the right direction, he's not moving the country in the right direction, and you drill down and ask them why, it's because he wasn't able to get Build Back Better passed, he wasn't able to get voting rights passed, and who blocked that? Well, obviously every single Republican in Congress, but also Manchin and Sinema, the so-called moderate Democrats.
Right. Manchin and Sinema, you throw them into moderate, and I think that I've been considered a moderate Democrat. But all the things that you talk about that progressive do, I'm in favor of 80% of it.
Yeah.
When it comes to, just about everything you do. When you're talking about moderate, I'm in favor of it. So most Democrats, period, are in favor of it. But we got to get ourselves in position so that we can make these things happen. But if we get into, even with these people, we know we got to bring people on in this upcoming election so that we don't have to depend on people like what's his name?
Manchin. And Schrader.
Manchin and Sinema.
I'm with you, Jerry.
We got to do.
I'm with you. And it's why, more often than not, when I'm referring to these people, instead of calling them moderate Democrats, I call them corporate Democrats, because that's where I think the problem is in our party. Jerry, thank you. Thanks for a thoughtful conversation. I appreciate it. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's the place where smart people get their news. Back with your calls right after this. And welcome back. John in Seattle. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Tom. I pulled out an article on about Lawrence Tribe. They wrote an article in the Washington Post, September 8, 2021, about Merrick Garland, that he has had a way of Merrick Garland dealing with the Abortion Rights Act with the way Texas has been dealing with the whole women's health.
Uh-huh.
And it said here, Attorney General Merrick Garland should treat bounty hunting under SB-8 as a criminal deprivation of civil rights, leading to possible federal prosecutions under two sections of the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Mm-hmm. That law was passed to protect the civil rights of previously enslaved Americans who were targeted for extrajudicial violence by white supremacist vigilantes. And in an 8-1 opinion by Chief Justice Warren Burger, no liberal himself, the Supreme Court, 1982, held that such veto power could easily be invoked for religious, ideological, or illicit reasons that could well be undetected, making the scheme unconstitutional on its face. So it's a great article, and it's something that Merrick Garland mentioned or Lawrence Tribe mentioned that Merrick Garland could do that if he wanted to.
Well,
and I haven't seen Merrick Garland do very much as far as protecting the people who are being, attacked at the schools. And, I heard about a judge being shot, dealing with a case with abortion. And people just all around, I thought he had some kind of a task force set up to round these people up. I mean, it's getting out of hand. And I thought Merrick Garland was kind of going to do his job and get out there. And, I haven't seen anybody get locked up for, violating people's rights.
Yeah. Yeah. I would like to see Merrick Garland behaving more like Bobby Kennedy, during the civil rights era, and just going right into the states and bringing in federal troops or whatever it takes. It's obviously not him. It's not what he's going to do. And I think by extension, we can assume that it's not what Joe Biden wants, although Biden has taken a very hands-off approach to the DOJ, which, I could argue either side of that.
Well, Herbert Hoover, didn't he have Hoover had a task force going, didn't he? And I mean, it seemed to work pretty well.
He had a bunch of them. I just with regard to Garland, the one thing that we have to keep in mind, and maybe it's false hope, but it is that generally speaking, prosecutors don't talk about cases until they bring them. They don't want to contaminate the jury pool. They don't want to screw up the witnesses. They don't want to put people on notice of what's coming to get them. And so the day that you learn that the Justice Department and Merrick Garland have been doing something is the day that they take somebody down. We'll see.
Yeah, but I don't see any action happening with the threats that are being made.
I agree.
And
I agree.
Sad because I just
me.
cringe every time I go, where's Merrick Garland?
Yeah, I'm with you. John, thank you. Thank you for the call. It's 52 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. Back in 1981, the first year of the Reagan presidency, one of our two senators from Oregon here, Mark Hatfield, wrote an op-ed for the Oregon Territory newspaper about the new right, about this whole movement that had seized the Republican Party. And in it, he called them out for escalating nuclear arms, for opposing the Equal Rights Amendment, for opposing abortion, for supporting school prayer, and for their argument that if you weren't on their side, you were not patriotic. He also goes into a long rant about how they're exploiting religion for political purposes, and he thinks it's damaging Christianity as well as America. And then finally he says, finally, persistent threats of racism lie directly below the surface of new right ideology. And then he goes into this whole rant about that. It's really extraordinary how, what Reagan was doing is coming back into vogue. I got a whole video about the whole thing over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. 53 minutes past the hour. Rick in Danby, New York. Hey, Rick, what's up?
Hi, Tom.
Hey.
Live in a very red part of upstate New York. I got a call from a neighbor who is working on the school district school board elections, and that was yesterday. And she asked me to call the neighbors on our road, and I did, and we all turned out, and 9 of us voted, and the election was decided by 7 votes.
Wow! In favor of the non-Trumpy candidate?
You betcha.
Wow.
Boy, it felt so good.
That is incredible, Rick.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. We appreciate your encouragement.
Yeah, I appreciate you showing up. I mean, that's an impressive story, Rick. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. That an inspiration on a otherwise relatively slow Wednesday. Sandra in Omaha, Nebraska. Hey, Sandra, what's on your mind today?
Well, I just wondered if a group of dedicated citizens could file a class action lawsuit against the Supreme Court for allowing money to decide who wins elections, because that's clearly what they've done.
Right.
And it's working very well.
And they doubled down on it yesterday.
Yeah. And I just feel like, I'm done with it. What's the point of even bothering with an election? Just tell us who you're going to pick and who paid the most money, because that's what it is.
Right, 9 out of 10 times. In fact, it's even higher than that. It's over 90% of elections are won by the people who spent the most amount of money.
Yeah.
And then the Supreme Court yesterday just made it so much easier to directly bribe politicians, through their campaigns. I'm with you, Sandra, in my outrage. I share your outrage. I think it's absolutely wrong. I think the court has corrupted our politics to the point that we're heading down the road to fascism, and the Supreme Court is the principal promoter of this. We have to understand that these people who are on the court, by and large, were put there with the help of right-wing billionaires who wanted this outcome. And what I do know, though, is that you can't file a class action lawsuit against the Supreme Court. Sovereign immunity.
They should be able to.
Yeah, you should. Sovereign immunity protects them. The only way to do anything about the Supreme Court, well, there's a couple of options. Number one, they can be impeached. That's probably not going to happen. It requires a 2/3 majority in the House and Senate. Or it requires a majority in the House and 2/3 majority in the Senate. That's not going to happen. Number two, you can pass a constitutional amendment or a law that reverses their rulings, and that's probably the optimal way to go about specific things like money in politics. And number three, Congress can exercise their Article 3, Section 2 authority to regulate the court and expand the size of the court. And, I think all of those things can and should be done. The first, as I mentioned, is probably going to be politically impossible. But, if we don't do something about money in politics, and like I said, the court just expanded it even further yesterday with this decision in favor of Ted Cruz. If we don't do something about money in politics, we're not going to have a democracy anymore. I mean, arguably, much of it is already gone. Sandra, thank you for the call. Spot on. And this is why, and the fourth thing is be sure that there's always a Democrat in the White House, because it's the president who nominates members of the Supreme Court. This is why they were so gung-ho, why the Supreme Court itself wanted to put George W. Bush in office in 2000.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at CozyEarth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at HartmannReport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at Dinovite.com.
We take life back!
book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists.
However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had master slaves, feudalism had lords serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the third hour of our program. So, in the course of my life, my years on this planet, I've seen America go through basically 3 phases of widespread, heavily popularized, heavily promoted drug use that was all legal. I remember in the late 1950s, early 1960s, I think it was around the time my youngest brother was born, my mother was on Valium for a while. In fact, in 1965, the Rolling Stones did a song about this called Mother's Little Helper. It was so widespread. Housewives all across America were taking Valium. Then they learned that the benzodiazepine drugs, which Valium was the earliest one, can cause addiction and all kinds of weird problems. And so we got rid of that. And then, 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago, I don't recall how long ago it was, one of my old friends from high school, his name was Bill, was injured, got addicted to OxyContin, ended up overdosing, and he's dead now. We figured out, oh, well, that wasn't such a great idea, passing OxyContin out to everybody and other kinds of narcotics, and so we pulled back from that. And then back 7, 8 years ago, when my wife Louise had breast cancer and had surgery and chemo and went through, as a consequence of the drugs she was taking to suppress estrogen, was going through just a wild case of hot flashes. They put her on an SSRI drug, which are typically used as antidepressants, like Prozac kind of drugs. This was a super low dose. It was just intended to treat hot flashes. And she was on it for about a year, and when she went off, for weeks, she was getting electric shocks in her brain and just all kinds of wild symptoms. And I've been wondering ever since that happened, and that, like I said, that was years ago. When is the opiate, when is the Valium reckoning coming for SSRI drugs? Because it sure did not look like a good thing to me. Well, P.E. Moskowitz is on the line with us. P.E. is a writer of Mental Health, a newsletter about your broken brain, a lecturer who taught college classes, the author of 2 books, with a third in process, and the co-founder of the Media Collaborative Study Hall. Moskowitz.xyz is their website, Moskowitz. And their Twitter handle is _PEM_PEM, PEM. P.E. Moskowitz, welcome to the program. You have been writing about this issue, and you're a contributor to The Nation magazine and others. And this piece, Breaking Off My Chemical Romance. Tell me what's going on here with SSRIs, these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs that are supposed to cure depression.
Yes, so I've been interested in these drugs for a while because, like millions upon millions of Americans, I've struggled with mental health for a large part of my life and was kind of resistant to medication for a long time. And then, under the recommendation of a psychiatrist, one year just decided to try an SSRI or an SNRI, which is a similar class of drug. And she gave me basically no information about it. She was like, these are good drugs and there won't really be any side effects. The side effects are rare. Of course, that turned out to not be true. I, gained a bunch of weight on the drug. I had all these kinds of weird other side effects. and then trying to get off the drug, as you talked about with your wife, I had these horrible brain zaps. I, felt more depressed and anxious than ever. And it felt strange that no one had told me about any of this. And so I started looking more into it and realizing that, thousands of people online, every time I would tweet about something like this, dozens of people would be in my direct messages saying, this happened to me too, and no one is talking about it. So I wanted to start looking into the research and the kind of general consensus amongst scientists and psychiatrists about these drugs, and seeing if the story is as rosy as we've made it out to be, which it turns out, obviously, it's not.
So are the symptoms that you had and that Louise had, and I'm telling this story with her permission, by the way, of these brain zaps. I mean, I've never experienced that, but she was describing it to me. I mean, I watched it happen. I mean, from the outside, and it seemed like she was getting like little miniature explosions inside her brain that were sometimes accompanied by sparks and colors and often by wild emotional swings. Is this the kind of thing that is normal for people who are trying to withdraw from these drugs, or is this are you guys outliers?
No, it's pretty normal. The prescription drug industry and the research they fund suggests that only a small percentage of people really experience SSRI withdrawal, but more independent research shows that up to 50% of people experience these longer-term effects and have a really hard time getting off the drugs. And that just makes logical sense. For some reason, antidepressants were seen as somehow different than any other drug. And I'm not anti-drug, but we should think of drugs as drugs. And so if you take a Valium every day, if you take even drinking coffee every day, you expect your brain to adapt to it. And so when you get off of it, you experience withdrawal effects, even if it's just drinking coffee. So why would these drugs be any different? And for so long, we've been taught that they somehow are different, that there wouldn't be withdrawal somehow. But now we're starting to discover that the withdrawals can be really horrible, and they are extremely, extremely common.
Now, I think it's really important to point out at this point that this category of drugs, or this class of drugs, can slightly flatten affect. There's an upside and downside of that. Affect being, the intensity of the emotions that you feel and that you express. The downside of it is, people like Dr. Peter Breggin, who are out there saying that, this huge number of school shooters were on these drugs. That, I think the jury is still out on that. It's speculative, but the upside is that for people who are struggling over the short term with, some horrible emotional crisis, their partner just died, or terrible things have happened in their lives. Sometimes it's useful to soften our emotions for a little while and get through something, I suppose is the argument. But I've also seen numerous studies suggesting that, generally speaking, the results of these drugs in terms of dealing with psychological illnesses are, for many people, indistinguishable from those of placebos. Now, that said, clearly these drugs do help some people, and I'm not saying that they should be pulled off the market or anything like that. It seems to me like we should be looking at them the same way we look at Valium and OxyContin, which are still on the marketplace. What say you? You've done the much deeper dive on the research on this than I have.
Yeah, so back, about 20 years ago, Irving Kirsch, who directs the placebo studies program at Harvard, so he's not like a kook or like some kind of fringe scientist, he's at Harvard University, started looking into this and using Freedom of Information Act requests to get the unpublished studies about SSRIs and SNRIs, because the prescription drug industry usually only publishes the ones that show positive results. And what he found when you compare all those studies is that the difference between someone on an SSRI versus someone who's just taking a placebo is extremely negligible. And his research proved to be extremely controversial. There was all this kind of backlash to it. Obviously, the industry was very upset. But there was just recently, in the last month or so, a humongous study released. Tens upon tens of thousands of people were in this study. And it found that over a period of a few years, there was still no difference in the quality of life of people who had been taking antidepressants and who identified with having depression, and people who weren't taking antidepressants and who also identified with having depression. So, yeah, I'm not suggesting that these drugs work for no one, but it seems like they've been oversold, yet in the same way that OxyContin and these other drugs have as kind of a miracle cure for OxyContin was for physical pain. This is for mental pain. And they're kind of just doled out. If you go to a primary care doctor, they're just kind of doled out as soon as you say you're struggling with depression or anxiety or just grief because someone in your family died or whatever. And no one is really thinking about the long-term consequences of that or whether they will actually be helpful. 70% of prescriptions of antidepressants come from primary care doctors, not psychiatrists. So the vast majority of people are going in, getting one appointment, seeing a primary care doctor who doesn't even specialize in mental health, getting put on these drugs. They may or may not help, and then they have to deal with all these side effects. So I don't want to say no one should take them, but I do think that they're extremely overprescribed.
Yeah, I think we're on the verge of a third great cycle in my lifetime. You know, the Valium one, the opiate one, and now the SSRI one. We'll see, though. They've got a multi-billion-dollar industry behind them. P.E. Moskowitz, writer of Mental Health, a newsletter about your broken brain. Moskowitz, Moskowitz.xyz on the internet. P.E., thanks a lot for dropping by. It's great talking with you.
Thank you.
Yep. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a second. It's 16 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. And let's see here. Patrick in East Lansing, Michigan. Hey, Patrick, thanks for watching us on Facebook Live. What's on your mind today?
Oh, I just wanted to thank you for raising up the Supreme Court issue, but I wanted to put another option on your list on the table, which I think should be the focus of our efforts politically. And the reason I say that, you're right, the campaign finance issue has our whole democracy by a stranglehold. Citizens United has really taken our power away. And reading the Ted Cruz case from the Supreme Court yesterday was appalling because he took out almost $400,000 in loans, and then they got paid back by his donors once he was elected, and now that can't be regulated.
Right.
And it's astonishing because once you're elected, then you can be bribed by the repayment of your loans. At least before, you were getting your donations before they knew if you'd win.
Right.
Although we know incumbents win. And that strict scrutiny, which was invented by Justice Roberts, was pulled out of thin air. I mean, they're just making this stuff up. So that goes right alongside with the abortion issue. But here's what I would add to your list. Larry Tribe, the very well-regarded Harvard Law constitutional law professor, has embraced in the Biden commission a proposal to change the number of justices on the Supreme Court, and I call this unpacking the court.
Yep.
And I
or
say
rebalancing.
that because and I say that because Trump got 3 appointments, Carter got 1, Nixon got 3, and the Trump and Nixon appointments totally changed the directions of the court and were highly politicized and highly ideological.
Let's not forget Reagan too. I mean, there's just been a bunch of.
So my
Clarence Thomas was
reason
George
to
Herbert Walker Bush.
Yes. So I wanted to add to your list because the long-term solution is not to have a partisan change where you have Democrats adding 4. And everyone will say to you, isn't that going to politicize the court? And the answer is it's already politicized, and it's taken away our chance at a democracy, and it's given us an oligarchy. And Franklin Roosevelt knew that and told the Hughes Court that in the 30s, and his threat to do this very thing changed their rulings. We're not going to get any such luck here. We have to, with our 50 votes, change the filibuster and add 4 seats. If we add 3, it's a deadlocked court. It's been done 6 times in our history, nothing new, same thing. Congress has to be the one to act, or else the Supreme Court's totally illegitimate. And I say that because we have the hardest constitution in the world. Of all 200 constitutions ever adopted in industrialized countries, ours is the hardest to amend in the world. And just since the 40s and 50s, these justices have outlived the presidents that appointed them and the electoral mandate that gives them some claim to legitimacy. So the solution is add 4 seats, just as this Biden commission recommends, and then put up a constitutional amendment that says we need to go back to the way the Supreme Court used to function, where you assign them to panels. You have 9 justices randomly assigned. The rest of the time they decide other appeal cases. This is Congress's power. And then give them a 12-year limit, and every president gets 2 justices. And then there's no partisan problem. We don't have them serving 20 years after the president who appointed them, and they have some democratic accountability. That's the solution.
I'm with you, Patrick. I'm with you. And, you know, Lord willing, I hope the Democrats and Biden can get together on this. Thank you. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Back in 2018, Pastor Dave Barnhart of the St. Juania United Methodist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, delivered a sermon that is worth revisiting. He said, "The unborn are a convenient group of people to advocate for. They never make demands of you. They are morally uncomplicated, unlike the incarcerated, addicted, or the chronically poor. They don't resent your condescension or complain that you're not politically correct. Unlike widows, they don't ask you to question patriarchy. Unlike orphans, they don't need money, education, or childcare. Unlike aliens, they don't bring all that racial, cultural, and religious baggage that you dislike. They allow you to feel good about yourself without any work at creating or maintaining relationships. And when they're born, you can forget about them because they cease to be unborn. It's almost as if, by being born, they have died to you. You can love the unborn and advocate for them without substantially challenging your own wealth or power." The whole clip is over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. I overwrote that one, Sean. Welcome back. Okay, picking up your phone calls. Jeff in Buffalo, New York. Hey, Jeff, what's on your mind today? Thanks for listening to Sirius XM.
Good afternoon, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I'm just calling in regards to New York's 27th district, Chris Jacobs, a heavily gerrymandered district, which I live in. Not a peep from him about the terrorist attack at Pop's supermarket here in Buffalo, New York, which I live approximately 10 miles, 12 miles away, somewhere around there.
Is he a Democrat or Republican?
No, he's a Republican. He succeeded Chris Collins, that criminal. And then before him was Chris Lee. If you remember Chris Lee, the other Republican who was trolling transgender prostitutes in Washington, D.C. on Craigslist.
Whoa.
And ultimately resigned over it. And then we got Tom Reed on the other side of us, and thankfully we have Brian Higgins. But I guess the point of my call is we'll never get anything from these Republicans. If Las Vegas, Sandy Hook, Parkland, and the list goes on, if nothing got done then, what makes anybody believe that anything is going to happen now?
Well, the one thing that could cause something to happen now is if there is a larger Democratic majority in the United States Senate and the House, starting next January, and we can get around Joe Manchin, who's anti-gun control, and get around, the few Democrats in the House who are also owned by the NRA. We need bigger numbers. There you go. Jeff,
I couldn't agree more. I just want to express my sadness for those involved.
Yeah, I'm with you, Jeff. Thank you very much, and thanks for calling from Buffalo.
Thank you,
it's got to be a tough time for you and your community. Walter in Streamwood, Illinois. Hey, Walter, what's on your mind today?
This Roe versus Wade.
I'm sorry?
It's Roe versus Wade.
Oh, Roe v. Wade. Yeah, okay.
Taking abortion rights away from women.
Mm-hmm.
I see this on TV where a politician is pointing at a young girl saying, would you want to kill her? And I see this, I don't know, my daughter, I asked her, I said, well, what's the deal with this adoption? Because I wanted to look into this. And she said, well, a girlfriend of hers that she knew about 8 years ago wanted to adopt a child. And she couldn't find the child to adopt here in the United States. She had to go to China.
Yeah, that's very
And
much, yeah, go ahead.
She said she paid $80,000.
Yep.
So I thought, I'm going to look this up. So I look it up. And Illinois, it has this adoption cost of $36,400. And I called her back and I said, what's the deal on that? And she said, well, at first she hadn't told me that they didn't have the adoption children that she needed and she had to go to China. So anyways, my thought is this. I don't believe that these guys are in sole demand of saving a life. What I believe is the politicians from these companies that do that adoption, that are making all this money on it, had one of their lobbyists go to the politicians and say, hey, look, we need more children. And the only way they can get it is for the women that have the babies
to be forced to carry babies to term. Yeah, Walter, it's conceivable, and it's kind of an extreme conspiracy theory to think that that's happening, but the reality is that adoption is a billion-dollar industry in the United States, and it can be very, very expensive, particularly if you want to adopt a white baby in the United States. It's as opposed to Hispanic, black, or babies from overseas. I mean, But my guess is that that's not really what's driving it. I just have a hard time thinking that it's gotten that cynical. On the other hand, at first when they said that the private prison companies were pushing drug laws, I didn't believe it.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And then it turned out it was completely true. The private prison industry wanted longer sentences for possession of marijuana. Why? They wanted more customers.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Legacy of Secrecy, The Long Shadow of the JFK Assassination by Lamar Waldron and me. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963 triggered cover-ups by officials, this is from the introduction, by the way, that continue to negatively impact American politics, life, and foreign policy. Legacy of Secrecy details those cover-ups and hidden investigations, many for the first time, including the reasons they were carried out under such intense secrecy. Most were spawned by John and Robert Kennedy's top-secret 1963 plan to stage a coup against Fidel Castro, a plan so highly classified that it only started to be exposed in 2005 and is finally revealed in this book. Their own confessions now show the three mafia bosses, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Johnny Roselli, were behind JFK's assassination. They used parts of the secret coup plan to kill JFK in a way that forced Attorney General Robert Kennedy, President Lyndon B. Johnson, excuse me, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and high CIA official Richard Helms to withhold critical information not only from the public and the press, but also from each other and sometimes their own investigators. It's important to keep in mind that JFK was murdered just a year after the tense nuclear standoff during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The main goals of U.S. officials were to prevent a nuclear confrontation with the Soviets and to protect JFK's ally high up in the Cuban government. Commander Juan Almeida, head of the Cuban Army in 1963, still listed as Cuba's number 3 official today. While U.S. leaders have managed to prevent a confrontation with Russia and preserve a critical ally in the Cuban government, this limited the investigation into JFK's murder, allowing the 3 mafia chiefs and their associates to remain free. As a result, the long shadow of secrecy surrounding both JFK's murder and the coup plan set the stage for the murder of Martin Luther King, ultimately driving 2 presidents from office and bringing about the murders of 5 congressional witnesses in the mid-1970s. Legacy of Secrecy breaks important new ground in key areas, detailing for the first time Louisiana Godfather Carlos Marcello's clear confession to ordering JFK's assassination. Marcello's criminal empire ranged from Dallas to Memphis, and previously secret files at the National Archives have shown that he made this confession in 1985 to an FBI informant ruled credible by a federal judge as part of a secret FBI undercover sting operation named Camtex. Exposed here for the first time, Camtex yielded Marcello's admission that he'd met Lee Harvey Oswald and set Jack Ruby up in business in Dallas. The operation also generated hundreds of hours of heretofore secret prison audio tapes of Marcello discussing his crimes, recorded using the FBI informant's bugged transistor radio. Yet the FBI and Justice Department withheld most of that information from the public and Congress for years until its revelation in this book. Carlos Marcello wasn't the only mob boss who confessed his involvement in JFK's murder to a trusted associate. Legacy also uncovers important new information about Marcello's partners in JFK's assassination, Tampa Godfather Santos Trafficante and Johnny Roselli, the Chicago Mafia's man in Las Vegas and Hollywood. Shortly before their deaths, both mobsters admitted their roles in JFK's murder to their attorneys. 2 of their associates with documented ties to the secret JFK Almaheda coup plan likewise confessed. Using exclusive new information supported by FBI files apparently withheld from Congress, this book names 2 of the Georgia men who paid James Earl Ray to kill the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, white supremacist Joseph Miltier and Hugh R. Spake. Miltier, who had been involved in Marcello's murder of JFK, was part of a small clique of racists in Atlanta who used Marcello to broker the contract to murder Dr. King. We document James Earl Ray's ties to Marcello's heroin smuggling operation and long overlooked evidence in FBI files linking Ray to Marcello's associate, Johnny Roselli. Finally, this book explains why Ray, while fleeing to Canada the day after killing Dr. King in Memphis, made a 400-plus mile detour south to Atlanta, where he contacted Spake to get help from Miltier. In 1979, the last congressional committee to investigate the murders of JFK and Dr. King, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, concluded, quote, that Trafficante, like Marcello, had the motive, means, and opportunity to assassinate President Kennedy, end of quote from the congressional report. The HSCA had been created in the wake of Roselli's sensational murder, but the HSCA was unable to establish direct evidence of Marcello's complicity. And the same was true for Trafficante and Roselli, because the CIA, FBI, and other federal agencies withheld so many relevant files. The HSCA, headed by civil rights figure Louis Stokes, also concluded there was a likelihood of conspiracy in the assassination of Dr. King and that financial gain was James Earl Ray's primary motivation. But they were unable to determine who had paid Ray or how the conspiracy had worked because the FBI and other agencies had hid critical files. With the help of more than 24 associates of John and Robert Kennedy, backed up by thousands of recently released documents at the National Archives, many of which are quoted here for the first time, Legacy tells the full story denied to Congress and the American people, Legacy of Secrecy.
Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. The American Lung Association just came out with an amazing new study where they took Joe Biden's goal of a zero-emission power grid by 2035 and zero-emission passenger vehicles across the United States by 2035, which is a ways down the road, and trucks and buses being zero emission by 2040, and said, okay, what will happen if we do this? they discovered that over 100,000 lives would be saved, people who wouldn't be getting cancer and COPD and asthma and all these kind of things. Over $1.2 trillion in public health costs would be avoided, and just massive, and 2.8 million fewer asthma attacks, among other public health problems. They note how extraordinary this would be, what a huge and positive impact it would have on America's public health, and how it's completely doable, the American Lung Association. The one note they say is that, quote, opposition from Republicans and 2 key Democratic senators makes it easier said than done. You can check it out at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. 35 minutes past the hour, and Francis in Seattle. Hey, Francis, what's on your mind today?
What's on my mind is it's Reagan's fault about the psychiatric drugs. Before 1975, 90%, I might be a little off on that, of the medical research was funded by the federal government, so it was nonprofit, and they were actually looking for answers to specific problems it needed solving. Mm-hmm. And Reagan just all around, and he took all the money instead of the government having panels of experts look at all the applications for money. They just handed it all over to private companies to make profit off of it.
Well, mostly went to universities, but yeah. It's still the case, by the way, Francis. Most of our drugs are not developed by the pharmaceutical companies themselves. Numerically, the number of drugs the pharmaceutical companies develop themselves is a majority. But the majority of those are tweaks on existing drugs. When you're looking at new classes of drugs, a new category of antibiotics, a new category of antidepressants, a new category of pain relievers, a new category of immune suppressant drugs, all of those, virtually every single one of those was the product of research done in universities around the United States that was funded by the National Institutes of Health, which is your tax dollars and mine.
Right. And the other thing I would have to say to that young man is that the corporatization of healthcare and the lack of enforcement of antitrust laws means that everybody is just given a drug. And we've known for decades that the most effective treatment for depression works the fastest, lasts the longest, is to combine medication and psychotherapy. But psychotherapy doesn't have much profit for any giant corporation.
Yep. Amen. And, most psychiatrists don't do psychotherapy anymore because they can see 4 or 5 patients an hour if they just write prescriptions. And, and a lot of the insurance companies will not pay for psychotherapists. They'll only pay for psychiatrists. So, it's one of those weird situations. Francis, thank you. Very well said. Tony in Fort Worth, Texas. Hey, Tony. Thanks for listening to Sirius XM. What's on your mind?
Tom, I take Zoloft. I've been taking antidepressants for roughly 4 years. I've tried them.
Is that an SSRI drug?
Yes.
Okay.
And?
Tony, you got to listen to me on the phone here rather than the radio.
I'm sorry, my headset died. I'm sorry, but I have the same effect that your wife has. I'm trying to get myself off of them with my doctor's advice, and now I'm down to 25 milligrams every other day. But I can't miss a day, because if I miss a day, it feels like my brain is exploding. I feel like I'm being electrocuted. It's like this big hot flash runs through my body, and a vice is on my head. It is the worst feeling that you can have. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And God help your wife.
Well, she got through it, and I think she could tell a story better than me, but doesn't like to come on the radio. But I know that what a lot of people do is what's called titration. So, they'll start out for a week cutting their pills in half, doing this with your doctor's advice, by the way. First of all, let's always right. Have that caveat. The first week, cut the pill in half. Second week, cut the pill down to a quarter. The third week, take an eighth. And eventually you're taking nothing. And that's, for a long, long time, that's been kind of the standard way that people wean themselves off benzodiazepine drugs, the Valium drugs, and opiates. Whether that works with SSRIs or not, I'm not certain, but I'm pretty sure that that's what Louise did to get past it. And then ultimately, you just have a week or two where you have to say, this is it. I'm going to have a really crappy week or two, and maybe I'll take a vacation week or something. But my brain's going to be shocking me, but I'll get through this.
That's probably what I'm going to have to do, because it is the worst feeling, and then the mood swings because it makes my wife go crazy, because one second I'll be fine, and then the next second she'll look at me, what's wrong?
Yeah.
I'm like, nothing. But something needs to be done.
Yeah, as long as you can keep reminding yourself, it's just a damn drug, it's not me, and this too shall pass. I mean, those two slogans seem to work really well for people who are going through drug withdrawal. And I went through that when I was a teenager with narcotics. I broke my back skydiving when I was 19 years old. So I have some personal experience in this area too. And but that, as far as I know, and I'm not offering you medical advice here, Tony. I can't do that. I'm not qualified to. But if your doctor is encouraging you to titrate down, then that's the way to do it. And I've seen, I've read online stories of people who are getting down to, almost homeopathic doses of some of these drugs, where they're taking a 16th, a 32nd, a few grain. They'll take one pill and grind it up really fine and mix it up with some water or a little bit of water and alcohol so it's thoroughly dissolved. And then they'll take, a couple of drops out of a dropper every day for a week. I mean, it's trying to get down to like micro amounts of it to try to minimize the withdrawal. But eventually you do hit that point where you just got to go to zero and say, okay, it's going to be a rough ride. I went through that with smoking too. When Louise got pregnant, we were both smokers, and she said, she quit smoking immediately and said, if you want to continue sleeping in our bedroom, you're going to quit smoking too. And I put a pack of cigarettes on top of the refrigerator, and I would yell at it every day. And, that was harder than quitting narcotics, frankly. But
I can believe it.
Yeah, but
these prescriptions, they're, literally, once they get you hooked, they've got you, and they do not make it easy to. It's almost like trying to get out of an abusive relationship. It doesn't. They make it.
It's a good analogy.
Possible.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. Tony, I got to move along, but thank you. I wish you the very best, my friend. You're going through what many of us have gone through with other drugs and what many people are going through with SSRIs, and there is light at the other end of that tunnel. Well,
at least I know I'm not by myself.
Yeah, there you go. And also, the good news is when we were running the Salem Children's Village, one of the first kids we had been in the state mental hospital for a year, and he had been on Thorazine for a year. Thorazine, an antipsychotic drug, produces what's called tardive dyskinesia, which is where your body twitches involuntarily. He's going to have that probably for the rest of his life. And that's why they've really dialed back on giving Thorazine and that whole family of drugs to people because of TD. And to the best of my knowledge, there's no such long-term consequence to withdrawing from any of the other drugs we've talked about today, be they narcotics or benzos or SSRIs or any of those things. So, that's really good news that there is light at the end of that tunnel.
This is true. It is.
Okay, Tony, good luck. Good talking with you. My pleasure.
Thanks.
Dennis in Springfield, Massachusetts. Hey, Dennis, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. How are you?
I'm well.
I wanted to ask about, Joe Manchin and cinema. Everybody, we pretty much accepted the fact that, the second build back wasn't going to happen. The voting rights, which is critical, obviously, wasn't going to happen. All this stuff now with Roe v. Wade and everything, gun rights, gun laws, all because of a man who comes from a state that is 1% of our population in this country. It's amazing to me. He runs Biden's agenda, and I'm just wondering, between him and Sinema, if you have any thinking on what would the Republicans do with someone like him? We know that they run a gangster operation over there. They don't care about anything in the laws or anything. And what would they do? How would they so-called blackmail a Manchin or whatever?
They wouldn't have to. They would embrace him and they would pay him off, and Kyrsten Sinema too. And I think that if the Republicans take control of the Senate, you're probably going to see those two switch to the Republican Party. Maybe not. I mean, I could be entirely wrong. But right now they have maximum power because they're the swing Democrats. If we get two, frankly, if we end up with a 51, 52, or 53 seat Democratic majority in the Senate, you may also see one of them switch to the Republican Party, playing the ultimate kingmaker by denying the Democrats a majority. I don't know what we can do about it other than, and I know Chuck Schumer is walking a very, very delicate line here. Try not to blow them away, but at the same time, try to bring them in and have them work with you at every opportunity possible. Dennis, this is just a real political tightwire, and it's frankly because of the Supreme Court, or not the Supreme Court, excuse me, because of the fact that every state has 2 senators. California, with over 30 million people, has 2 senators. West Virginia, with 3 million people, has 2 senators. Wyoming, with 500,000 people, has 2 senators. It's just not right, but it's the way it is, and we're not going to change that tomorrow. Thanks for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
45 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls here on your media support group for We the People. And welcome back. Let's see here. Whoops. Tim in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Hey, Tim, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, good afternoon.
Hey.
Just a couple quick points. Oh, by the way, I'm a long-time listener.
Oh, thank you, Tim.
First-time caller.
Thank you.
You were wondering where Rupert Murdoch has his residence.
Mm-hmm.
Beijing, China.
Seriously?
Seriously. Last I heard.
Huh. I know he married a Chinese woman who it appears to have turned out to have been a Chinese spy, but beyond that, I didn't know about. But they're divorced now. Wendy Deng, I think, was her name.
Well, this might not be current information, but the last I heard, he was living like an Oriental potentate.
Amazing.
And one other trivial point, I consider that Silent Spring to be a very important book.
Yeah, Rachel Carlson's book.
Well, that's just it. Her name is Carson.
Carson, thank you. You're right. I constantly
and that's about all I wanted to say to you.
Okay.
Enjoy your program. Keep up the good progressive work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. Appreciate it. Charlotte in San Diego. Hey, Charlotte, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to respond to the last guest you had on about SSRIs.
Mm-hmm.
I've been on SSRIs for over 20 years, and I'm diagnosed as bipolar. And and I'm not only on Zoloft, I'm also on a drug, that's actually labeled use as an anticonvulsive, but my psychiatrist put me on that because it levels my mood.
So you're one of those people for whom these drugs actually work. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Good.
I'm saying
Good.
they
I'm
work,
glad to hear that.
and I've gone off of them, and I've had no problems except my depression comes back. But I have no problems with brain, and I feel bad for your wife and the other people that are calling because that's serious. And I had a sort of that kind of reaction when I was on tricyclics, and I took an MAO inhibitor, and I ended up at New Year's Eve in the ICU with nearly had a stroke because my blood pressure went up so high because I took a diet pill.
Yeah, those are dangerous combinations.
Oh, very much so. And my head nearly blew off. The doctor said I just about had a stroke.
Wow.
And I was like 27 at the time. So I just want to say that for people that have actual biochemical depression, not situational depression like their spouse died, I think that the SSRIs are beneficial to a lot of people. I'm not saying to all people, but I don't want people that need help to panic and think this couldn't be an option. I think they need to check into who's prescribing it, too.
I agree with you.
I'm not sure that not sure that general doctors have any real knowledge of how these drugs work and interact.
Yeah, it should be psychiatrists.
Yeah.
I completely agree. And Charlotte, forgive my interrupting, but I heard that, I could see that break was coming. I completely agree. And I think that we need to start looking at these the same way we do benzo drugs, because there's still people taking Valium, here 50 years later, 70 years later. And opiates, there's still people taking opiates. It's not like we stop them or restrict them. We just be a little more careful, make sure the right people are getting them, like you. Charlotte, thank you so much for the call. Great to hear from you. We'll be right back. Hey, I've got a new book out. It's called The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy. Available wherever you find fine books. Back during World War I under President Wilson, we had a windfall profits tax on war profiteers, essentially, of 95% above their normal profits. You were allowed to make your normal profits, but when you started making more than that, 95% tax on that income. President Franklin Roosevelt revisited the exact same thing, windfall profits tax, during World War II, saying he didn't want this war to produce any new war millionaires. During the Korean War, Dwight Eisenhower had a windfall profits tax. During the echo of the fall of the Shah of Iran, when all the Iranian oil was taken off the marketplace and the price spiked, President Ronald Reagan imposed a windfall profits tax on the oil and gas industry to stop exploitation of that. Now we have Senator Bernie Sanders in the Senate and Ed Markey as well, along with him, and Representative Jamal Bowman in the House saying, let's do the same thing now. There's a whole video about it over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. It is 51 minutes past the hour. Thea in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hey, Thea, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. And I just want to say I saw you in Santa Fe about 20 years ago when you gave a talk. And I don't know if you remember that, but we've been fans of yours ever since.
Well, thank you. I remember being there. In fact, a picture from my being there, I think it was for years, was on my Wikipedia page. I haven't looked at it in a few years. But, a friend of ours there put it up there.
Yeah, anyway, this is regarding antidepressants.
Mm-hmm.
I was on Lexapro, which is an SSRI, and there's fine print that no one ever tells you about, and one is that you could have a toxic liver reaction, and that happened to me. I started to get jaundiced, and I'd say to my husband, do my eyes look yellow? Oh, there's a lot of sun here. Let's go to a different window. I mean, different mirror, or different...
Right.
I don't know. And then a friend said to us, oh, my God, Thea, you were jaundiced.
Yeah.
And I immediately went to the hospital, blah, blah, blah. Turned out I had toxic liver damage, which took a year to recover from.
Whoa.
And they say only 1 out of 100,000 people get this.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it's not that rare. But it sure is. I can't take an SSRI ever again.
Yeah.
I mean, I refuse to try another one.
Yeah, it sounds
and
wise.
The other thing is they talk about side effects. They should just say effects, because the quote-unquote side effects are just as strong as the good effects.
At least for you.
Just say these are the effects of the drug.
Yeah, because the caller before you was saying these drugs have saved my life, but she had been diagnosed with bipolar depression, which is really severe stuff. So
well, it helped me for 20 years too.
Yeah.
Until it didn't.
Yeah, there you go.
But it's like it took me a year to recover, and it was and you have to titrate off it really slowly. There's just no way about it.
Yeah.
The other possibility is to take microdoses of psilocybin.
Yeah, I can't recommend that because it's illegal everywhere except Oregon. But I've heard the same thing. Thea, I need to move along. But thank you for the call and thank you for sharing your story with us. I do appreciate it. Susan in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hey, Susan, you wanted to share something?
Hi, Tom. How are you?
I'm well. What's up?
Wanted to talk about the antidepressants.
Mm-hmm.
I was on Effexor, which is an SNRI, for 20 years, and I started having issues with it, narrow angles in my eyes, grinding my teeth, and I was just miserable from it. So my doctor gave me the advice of cutting it in half.
Mm-hmm.
Bad idea. And I didn't know what was wrong with me, so I went to my pharmacist. I said, how do you get off this stuff? She says, oh, take it an hour later every day and then stop. Well, I did that, and I was bedridden for 8 months, and the withdrawal is horrendous. I mean, I had brain zaps. I was vomiting, diarrhea every day, shaking.
Wow.
I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I went down to 106 pounds. Finally, after 8 months, I knew I was going to die, so I figured I better go back on it. And thankfully, I was one of those people who did go back on it and survived, because sometimes you don't. And I went back on it through a group on Facebook who talked me into reinstating. Immediately felt better. I was also on clonazepam because the Effexor made me jerk. So I took 6 months to get off that. A year later, I was able to finally fall asleep. And then I just started to attack the Effexor again. And I did 44 months of opening capsules, counting out the beads, less than 10% a month. And it took me 44 months to get off.
Wow. And you were reducing by
Yeah.
10% every single month, which would over time be 8, 9. Yeah.
Down to one bead. And after I got down to one bead, I quit.
So it's got little beads in it like the old contact cold capsules used to have?
Right. You open the capsule and you make other capsules. You feel like a drug addict. Making up the old
Totally get it.
capsule.
I totally get it.
But I was a moderator on the Effexor group. We have 7,000 members, and we have some members who didn't make it because it was so horrendous, the withdrawal. They killed themselves. Bizarre. It was bizarre, and we were never warned about this from our doctors, that we would go through such an awful thing.
Yeah. Susan, I really do think that this is the opiates for this decade. Susan, thank you for the call, and thank you for having the courage to share your story with us. And it's the end of the show, isn't it? So thank you all for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It's not a game. This is our lives. This is our children's lives. This is the future of this republic. And this may well be the future of our planet. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon. Be good to yourself and the people around you.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, how the death of privacy and the rise of surveillance threaten us and our democracy, by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at cozyearth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at HartmannReport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at Dinovite.com.